She had kept the secret for 5 months, 3 weeks and 4 days. She had kept it through the cold mornings, when her uniform no longer buttoned at the waist, through the afternoons, when she had to grip the edge of a doorframe to steady herself on the stairs, through every Friday when she cleaned Callum Reeve's private study and ran her gloved hands along the shelves of antique maritime maps, and tried not to think about the night she had first held one of those maps in her bare hands and looked up to find a man watching her like she was the most extraordinary thing in the room. That man had given her a false name. That man had slipped out of her apartment before dawn and left a note that said, "You are remarkable, Mara. I'll find you again." That man was Callum Reeve, heir to a Boston dynasty built on harbor contracts, private equity, and the kind of fear that moved through a city like a tide. She hadn't known. And now, in the silence of his private study on the 43rd floor of Reeve Tower, her center of gravity had finally betrayed her. She stumbled. Her hand shot out, not for the desk, not for the shelf, but instinctively, automatically to her stomach. And from the doorway behind her, a voice she had trained herself not to react to said quietly, "Careful." Everything was about to change. If you love stories about hidden secrets, impossible choices, and powerful men who have to earn every second chance, stay until the end. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Mara's story travels. Mara Voss had spent the better part of her adult life learning how to be invisible. It was a skill she'd cultivated the way other women cultivated a skincare routine or a yoga practice, methodically, consistently, with the understanding that the results would compound over time. In the rare documents rooms of Boston's archive institutions, invisibility meant patience, the ability to sit with a crumbling piece of vellum for 4 hours and reveal its secrets without imposing yourself on it. In the estates of the city's old money families, where she cleaned on weekends and some weekday mornings to cover her mother's care facility bills, invisibility meant something more tactical. It meant keeping your eyes down, your opinions unvoiced, your footsteps soft. It meant being furniture useful, present, unnoticed. She had been furniture in Reeve Tower for 6 months. The position had come through a private staffing agency that handled domestic and estate services for Boston's wealthiest families. The pay was nearly double what comparable jobs offered, which told Mara everything she needed to know about the risk premium baked into the work. The agency's coordinator had handed her a 2-page NDA with the same casual manner someone might hand over a parking validation. Mara had signed it without reading past the first paragraph. She needed the money. Her mother's room at Winthrop Care was $8,400 a month, and her archival consulting work, while steady, was not the kind of income that left room for dignity expenses. She came twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., and she cleaned with the same precision she applied to damaged parchment. The penthouse was 43 stories above the harbor, all glass and pale stone, and strategic emptiness. Callum Reeve's decorating philosophy, she had decided, was the aesthetic of controlled threat. Nothing soft, nothing unnecessary. Every surface chosen to reflect light back at you and give nothing away. He was rarely there when she came. She had seen him in person 4 times in 6 months. Once in the elevator, which he'd entered at the lobby without appearing to notice her. Once in the kitchen, where he'd been on the phone in a language she thought might be Irish Gaelic and had pointed at the coffee machine with a questioning look, and she had nodded because she'd already made a pot. Twice through the glass wall of his private study, had bent over the long mahogany table where he spread maps and documents and worked with a concentration so absolute it looked almost like grief. She had not stared. She had been furniture. The private study was always last on a rotation, and she approached it the way you approached an unexploded ordnance, carefully, respectfully, with a clear awareness of what it could do if she made a wrong move. The rules were simple. Do not touch the items on his desk. Do not move anything on the document table. Do not open the flat files. Empty the waste bin dust, the shelves, ensure the bar cart was stocked with the Jameson 18 he preferred, and leave. She had followed those rules with religious precision for 6 months. She had not always managed to keep her eyes down. The maps were the problem. She was a trained conservator. She had spent 5 years at the Boston Athenaeum, learning how to read paper the way doctors read skin, how to date parchment from the quality of its sizing, how to identify a genuine Flemish cartouche by the particular way a 17th century engraver pressed a burr into copper. The maps in Callum Reeve's private study were extraordinary. She could see that from across the room through the gloves in the brief seconds she allowed herself to look. There was a portolan chart in a climate-controlled case on the east wall that she was almost certain was late 15th century Genoese. There were navigational folios on the shelves, whose spines she had catalogued from memory on her third visit and spent the subsequent week cross-referencing against auction records in her head. She had said nothing. She was furniture. But on a Tuesday in October, she had paused just for a moment, just long enough for the wrong person to notice in front of the open flat file where he'd left a large vellum chart unprotected on the pull-out drawer. She hadn't meant to stop. Her body had simply overridden her discipline. It was a harbor chart of Boston's outer islands, probably late 18th century, and there was something wrong with it. The ink had been applied in two distinct phases, the second overlaid at a slightly different temperature, which meant either restoration or deliberate alteration, and either possibility was, "Do you know what you're looking at?" She'd spun around, her heart slamming against her ribs. He'd been standing in the doorway to the corridor, not the main study entrance, but the secondary one, the private access point that connected to his personal offices. He'd been there long enough to watch her stop. He had the stillness of someone who was used to people not noticing him until it was too late, and his eyes, gray, very direct, entirely unreadable, were focused on her with the particular quality of attention she associated with people who dealt in information. She had said the only thing she could say, "I'm sorry. I'll finish the cart and go." That wasn't an accusation, he'd said. It was a question. And she had made the single worst decision of that entire 6-month period. She had answered him honestly. "The ink's stratified," she'd said. "The base layer is original, probably post-revolutionary American, rather than British given the survey marks. But there's a second application over the harbor entrance. Someone altered this map." The silence that followed was the specific kind that meant she had said something she couldn't unsay. Callum Reeve had looked at her for a long moment. Then he'd said, "You're the cleaning staff." "Yes?" "You also know 18th century American cartographic techniques." "I work part-time as a documents conservator." She had kept her voice even. "The rest is my job. I'll leave." He had stepped aside from the doorway, which was either an invitation or a courtesy dismissal. She'd chosen to interpret it as the latter and walked out. She had driven home with her hands shaking and told herself it was the proximity to irreplaceable historical material, not the 40 seconds of being looked at, like she was the most interesting thing in the room. That had been 8 months ago, 4 months before she'd started cleaning his penthouse. She had not made the connection at the time. She had met him as Cal Reed at a private auction preview at the Harvard Club, a late evening viewing of a maritime collection where she'd been hired by the auction house to authenticate 3 pieces in question. He had been there as a potential buyer, and he had been charming in the quiet, particular way of men who didn't need to perform their status. They had talked for nearly 2 hours over bad auction house wine, and he had known things, genuinely known them, not the performative knowledge of a collector, about the pieces she was examining. He had made her laugh twice, which almost never happened during work. She had not gone home with him. She had gone to dinner with him, and then to a late bar, and this was the part she could not explain even now, even to herself. Even in the privacy of her own mind, she had asked him in when he walked her home at 1 a.m. He had been gone before she woke up. The note had said, "You are remarkable, Mara. I'll find you again." He had not found her. She had found him. 2 months after their one night together, she had discovered she was pregnant. 3 months after that, desperate for income that could cover both her mother's care and the prenatal appointments she could no longer defer. She had taken the Reeve Tower position through the agency without connecting the names. Reeve was old. Boston money. She'd known that much, but she hadn't known what Callum Reeve looked like. She had cleaned his penthouse for 2 weeks before she walked into the private study and saw him clearly for the first time and understood that the man who had given her a false name and told her she was remarkable was the man whose floors she was cleaning, was the man who controlled the port of Boston's informal economy, was the man whose name the other staff spoke in the particular low register reserved for things that could hurt you. She had kept cleaning. She had kept her eyes down. She had kept the secret until today. Until the rug and the stumble and the instinctive hand that moved to her stomach before her brain could countermand the order. Mara was 5 months and 3 weeks pregnant. She was showing not dramatically, not obviously, but the uniform that had been loose in September was taut across the middle now, in ways that, if you were paying attention, told a story she had worked very hard to keep from being told. And Callum Reeve, standing in the doorway of his private study on a Friday afternoon when he was supposed to be at a waterfront board meeting downtown, was a man who made a profession of paying attention. Careful, he said. She straightened. She turned around. He was exactly as she remembered. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark charcoal suit that managed to look expensive without announcing itself with the quality of stillness. She now understood was not natural composure, but trained control. The kind you learned when losing your composure had consequences. His hair was dark, slightly overlong at the collar. His eyes were the particular gray of harbor water before a storm. Those eyes were on her hands. She dropped them to her sides. It was already too late. "Mr. Reeve," she said, "I didn't realize you were back. I'll finish and leave. Stay." One word, very quiet. She stayed. He moved into the room, not toward her, but to the bar cart where he poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a heavy glass with the unhurried precision of a man who wanted her to understand he was in no rush. She stood near the flat files with her cleaning caddy in her hand and tried to control her breathing. The baby had been still all morning. Now, as if aware of the change in atmospheric pressure, she felt a flutter of movement, low and insistent. Not now, she thought. "Please, how long have you worked for me?" he asked, his back still turned. 6 months. "And in those 6 months, have I ever asked you a personal question?" Her throat tightened. "No." "Then I'll ask one now." He turned. His expression was closed, giving nothing away, but there was a quality of concentration in his face that she had seen once before in front of the altered harbor chart, the moment before he'd asked if she knew what she was looking at. "Are you pregnant?" The room felt like it was tilting. She had rehearsed this conversation in the abstract run-it in her head on the drive-in on the nights she couldn't sleep in the shower where no one could hear the words. In every version she lied. She was practiced at it. She had a name ready, a timeline ready, a story about an ex-boyfriend who was no longer in the picture. All of it evaporated. "Yes," she said. He set his glass down with a soft, precise click. "How far along?" 23 weeks. She watched his face. She watched him do the arithmetic 23 weeks back from today, which put conception at a specific window in late June, which mapped precisely onto the date of the Harvard Club auction preview. She watched the exact moment the calculation resolved. His expression didn't change. That was somehow worse than if it had. "I see," he said, after a silence that lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. "You're dismissed for today, Ms. Voss. I'd like you here tomorrow morning at 9. We have things to discuss." He paused. "That's not a request." Mara left. She did not remember the elevator ride. She did not remember the walk to her car in the parking structure, or the first 10 minutes of the drive home. What she remembered was the quality of stillness in his face, not shock, not anger, but the particular adjustment of a man who had just received information that changed his calculations about a situation he had not known was in progress. The most dangerous kind of man she had always thought was not the one who lost control. It was the one who didn't. Her apartment was in Charlestown, a second-floor walk-up, in a building that had been subdivided from a federal period townhouse and retained most of the inconveniences of both eras. The radiators knocked. The floors sloped slightly west. The windows looked onto a narrow street where the trees had gone bare in November, and the remaining leaves lay in wet plates against the curb. She sat at her kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface and thought about running. The math on running was simple and terrible. Callum Reeve was a man who had given her a false name, and then presumably spent some portion of the 8 months since looking for her. She did not know that yet. She was guessing based on the way he had looked at her in the study. The quality of unsurprise in his face, and he was a man who controlled significant portions of this city's infrastructure. If she disappeared, he would find her. If she ran, she would be found, and she would be found 8 months pregnant, or carrying a newborn, or with a months-old infant, which was not a position from which to negotiate. There was also the question she had been not asking herself since the moment she'd understood who Callum Reeve really was. What exactly did found mean in practice for a woman carrying the child of a man like that? She pressed her palms against the table until the wood steadied her. She was not naive about what the Reeve family controlled. You could not grow up in Boston's working waterfront neighborhoods, which she had in Eastie, in the shadow of the container port, and not have a layered understanding of who owned what and what that ownership meant. Her father had known. Her father had spent 20 years as a harbor inspector for the Massachusetts Port Authority and had known better than most people exactly where the legitimate economy shaded into something that looked legitimate only from the right angle. That knowledge had cost him. She did not let herself think about her father very often. It led to questions she couldn't afford to live inside. Her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. A car will be here at 8:45 a.m. Be ready. CR. Mara stared at the message until the screen went dark. She thought about the two letters at the end of it. She thought about the altered harbor chart in the flat file, and what it might mean that a man like Callum Reeve kept a falsified 18th century map in his private study. She thought about her mother at Winthrop Care in the room that was clean and adequately staffed, and nothing more than adequate, and about the daughter growing inside her who deserved more than adequacy. She set her phone down. She did not sleep. The car arrived at 8:43. It was a dark green Range Rover with a driver who introduced himself as Marcus spoke no further words and navigated the harbor tunnel with the efficiency of someone who drove this route often. They did not go to the main lobby of Reeve Tower. They went to an underground entrance that required a key card Marcus carried in his jacket past two security checkpoints that treated Mara's presence as expected, and rose in a private elevator to a floor she had never been on. The room Marcus led her to was not Callum Reeve's penthouse. It was a conference suite below the residential level. Long windows, a table that could seat 12, a view of the harbor that turned the morning light silver gray. The table had been set for two, not in a meeting configuration, but in a way that suggested a conversation rather than a proceeding. Callum was standing at the windows. He was dressed without a jacket, sleeves rolled to the elbows, which she was beginning to understand was not informality, but a form of statement. He was choosing to be seen as a person rather than a position. She filed this under things to think about later. "Sit down, Ms. Voss," he said, without turning. She sat. "I had you investigated," he said, still at the window. "Last night. I have people who work quickly. I know where you grew up, where you studied, where you work, who your mother is, what her diagnosis is, what her care costs, and approximately what your combined income looks like." He turned then and met her eyes directly. "I know you were working as an authenticator at the Harvard Club on June 17th. I know you left with a man who gave his name as Cal Reed." "Your alias," Mara said. Her voice was steadier than she'd expected. "One of them." He moved to the table and sat across from her. "I also know that your father was Daniel Voss, Harbor Inspector, Massachusetts Port Authority, for 22 years. A pause that had weight in it. Died on the job, December 2019. Something cold moved through her chest. "I know when my father died." "I know you do." His eyes held hers. "I want to tell you something, Ms. Voss, and I want you to understand that what I'm about to say is the truth, not a performance of the truth. I knew your father's name before last night. I knew it before you ever came to work in this building." The cold in her chest became something that pressed against her sternum. "What does that mean?" "It means we have more to talk about than I thought." He looked away briefly, something moving across his face that she couldn't categorize. "But first, what I need to understand from you is why you didn't tell me. When you realized who I was, why you stayed, why you kept cleaning these floors for 6 months, why you said nothing." Mara looked at him across the table. She thought about the 12 different answers she could give and chose the one that was simply true. "Because I was terrified," she said. "I'd heard what the Reeve name meant. I knew about the port contracts, the enforcement mechanisms, the way certain complaints disappeared when they got too close to certain business interests. And I was carrying your child, which meant that the moment you knew you would have leverage over me, that I would never be able to recover from. So I hid." She held his gaze. "I survived." Something shifted in his face. She could not quite read it. There was too much control, too many years of training, but she thought it might have been respect. "You hid well," he said. "I spent 4 months looking for you after the auction. You'd changed apartments. The address on your museum employee record was a P.O. box. Your phone was on a plan registered to your cousin." He leaned back slightly. "You were avoiding someone. An example. Before I knew you'd be looking." She paused. "You were looking. I left a note saying I would find you." His tone was even. "I meant it." The air in the room felt very still. Outside, the harbor was gray and bright with late autumn light, and a container ship was moving slowly through the channel, massive and unhurried, the way things moved when they had enough mass that nothing could stop them. "You said you knew my father's name before last night," Mara said. "Before you knew who I was. Explain that." Callum was quiet for a moment. He picked up the pen on the table in front of him and set it down again. A brief, controlled gesture, the equivalent of a flinch in a man who didn't flinch. "Your father filed a safety report in 2018, he said, a structural assessment of the Pier 14 facility on the outer harbor. He identified load-bearing deficiencies in the dock infrastructure and submitted the report to the Port Authority with a recommendation for emergency remediation. He looked at her. The report was suppressed. I know it was suppressed. Her voice came out harder than she intended. He filed it 3 times. Each time it was closed without action. 11 months later, the north section of Pier 14 collapsed. 3 dock workers died. She held his gaze. My father died 4 months after that. Heart attack officially. But he had spent the last year of his life trying to understand how a safety report with his name on it had been buried and why no one was being held responsible. Yes. Callum's voice was controlled and very quiet. I know. Do you know who suppressed it? The pause this time was different, heavier, with something compressed inside it. Yes, he said. I do. Mara's hands were flat on the table. She made herself breathe. Then tell me. Not yet. He held up a hand before she could respond. Not because I'm protecting anyone, not in the way you're thinking, but because this conversation has to happen in the right order, and there are things you need to understand about my family and about the situation you're now in before we get to what I know about your father's report. If I tell you out of sequence, you'll make decisions based on incomplete information, and those decisions will put you in danger. He met her eyes. More danger than you're already in, which is considerable, and which I intend to explain. Mara looked at this man across the polished table. This man who had given her a false name and told her she was remarkable, and whose child she had been carrying for 5 months and 3 weeks. She looked at his controlled face and his careful hands, and the way his jaw worked slightly when he held back something he wanted to say. And she thought, he knows something about my father's death, and he has known it. And he is sitting here telling me the sequence matters. Fine, she said. Then start from the beginning. Tell me who you actually are. The slight movement across his face, not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something in that register was the most honest thing she had seen from him since she'd walked into this room. That, he said, is going to take a while. He talked for 2 hours. Some of it she'd known or known the shape of the Reeve family, 3 generations in Boston's maritime economy, beginning in the 1940s with a harbor freight operation and expanding through legitimate acquisitions, insurance fronts, and let's discuss the informal enforcement apparatus that kept the port's labor peace in a particular configuration. The empire his grandfather had built with dock ledgers and handshakes, his father had expanded through private equity and municipal contracts, and which Callum had inherited at 29 when his father suffered a stroke that had left him technically alive and functionally absent for the past 8 years. What she hadn't known. What she watched him choose to tell her with the careful deliberateness of a man unloading weight he'd been carrying a long time was the internal architecture. The way the legitimate enterprise sat over the other operations like a surface over water, convincing from a distance, complicated up close. The way the port contracts weren't just about freight, but about information, who moved what. Through Boston's harbor, who needed that movement facilitated, who needed it not to be. The way the enforcement apparatus worked, not through direct violence, or rarely through direct violence, but through the withdrawal of cooperation, through the manipulation of inspections and permits, and the subtle machinery of municipal access. The safety reports, he said at one point, the ones your father filed. I need to tell you how I know about them. Mara had been still for 20 minutes. She made herself stay still now. The Pier 14 facility was operated under a subsidiary of a real estate holding company that my family controls, he said. The dock infrastructure assessments were routed through a port liaison office that was not independent. He looked at her. Your father's report was flagged to that liaison office. It was reviewed and suppressed by someone in my family's organization. Who? My uncle, he said. Bernard Reeve. He managed the company's port operations for 2 decades. A pause. He is currently still in that role. The name landed in Mara's chest like a weight. Your uncle suppressed a safety report that got 3 people killed. Yes. And you've known this. I have known this for approximately 3 years. His voice was controlled, but she could hear what the control was sitting on top of. Since I began a systematic audit of the company's compliance history after my father became incapacitated. I discovered the suppressed reports during that audit. I discovered the connection to the Pier 14 collapse. I discovered that 3 separate follow-up inspections had been obstructed and that your father's escalation attempts had been intercepted before reaching the state authority. And you did what with this information? I've been building a case? He met her eyes directly. Against my own family. Against the man who managed this company on my behalf for 20 years without my knowledge of what that management included. He set both hands flat on the table. This is not a performance, Ms. Voss. I'm not telling you this to earn your forgiveness or your cooperation. I'm telling you because you are carrying my child and because the fact of that child changes the timeline and the risk calculations in ways that you need to understand. Mara looked at him. She looked at his hands on the table, steady, deliberate, and at his face, which was doing that thing where it stayed controlled on the surface while something more complicated moved underneath. She thought about her father. She thought about a 3-page safety report filed in November 2018 and buried in an office her father hadn't known was compromised. She thought about 4 months of heart attacks and sleeplessness, and a man who had spent his last years trying to understand why no one was listening. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that your uncle, the man who runs your criminal operations, suppressed the reports that let the dock collapse happen, that my father spent the last year of his life trying to get someone to acknowledge that, and that you've been building a case against Bernard Reeve for 3 years. Yes, and now you've discovered that I exist." Her voice was very even. "A woman whose father your family's organization effectively silenced, who is pregnant with your child, who is therefore in your uncle's calculus an enormous liability, a leverage point against you, and a source of exposure if she ever connects the dots." Callum was quiet. "How long," Mara asked, "before Bernard finds out about me?" "I don't know," he said, "but I don't think it's long." The harbor outside the window was very wide and very gray. The container ship had moved beyond the frame. The light had shifted. "Then what happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "I tell you what I'm going to do to keep you safe. And then I ask not, instruct, not arrange if you'll stay." She looked at him across the table. "Tell me," she said. He did. The plan was not simple, and he did not pretend it was. He was going to move her out of her apartment, not as a hostage, not as a possession, but because her current address was accessible. And if Bernard moved to investigate the situation before Callum could contain it, an accessible address was a vulnerability neither of them could afford. He had a secure floor in the tower. She would have her own suite, her own entrance, the full run of the building's amenities. He would arrange for her mother's care to be transferred to St. Anne's, the best care facility in the greater Boston area, with a level of staffing and programming that her current arrangement could not approach. He would engage Dr. Patricia Huang, the most respected maternal fetal medicine specialist in New England, for her prenatal care. He said, also tell her the rest of what he knew about her father's report, including the names, the documentation, and what he intended to do with it as soon as he had arranged for her safety, because he was not going to deliver that information to a woman living alone in a Charlestown walk-up, where anyone who wanted access to her could find her within 20 minutes. "And if I say no," Mara said, "then I'll have you moved anyway." His voice was quiet and entirely direct. "I'm not going to apologize for that. You are carrying my daughter or my son, and I will not leave either of you exposed because I was too concerned about appearing reasonable to do what's necessary." He paused. "But I would rather you understand the reasons and choose to come. I would rather we start from something approaching honesty than from force." Mara thought about the walk-up in Charlestown. She thought about the lock on the front door that she had replaced twice in 3 years. She thought about her mother in Winthrop Care and the noise of the facility on busy nights, and the one time she had arrived for a Sunday visit to find her mother sitting in a damp chair for an indeterminate period because the afternoon aide had been pulled to cover another floor. She thought about a container ship moving through the harbor, massive and unhurried, unstoppable because of mass. "My mother doesn't know about the pregnancy," she said. "She will have to." "I know." Mara looked at her hands on the table. "I want to tell her myself. I want to do that before anything else moves. And I want to take her to St. Anne's myself. I want to be there when she sees the new room, and I want it to feel like a choice. I'm offering her not a transfer that was arranged over her head." Callum was quiet for a moment. "Done. And I want to know the rest of what you know about my father's report. All of it. Not on your timeline, on mine. When I decide I'm ready to hear it." Another pause. "Agreed. And I am not," she said, "your property. I'm not your employee. I'm not your ward, and I'm not a problem you're managing. If we're going to figure out how to do this, whatever this is, it starts from equal standing or it doesn't start at all." Something moved across his face. She still couldn't read it completely, but she thought watching it pass that it might have been the particular relief of a man who had been braced for compliance and received something more honest instead. "Equal standing," he said. Yes, then I'll come. She stood. But Callum, she used his first name deliberately, watching his slight reaction. I need you to understand something. I have been invisible in this city my entire life. I have been invisible in your building for 6 months. I am done being invisible. Whatever arrangement we make, however we manage the situation with your uncle and the rest of it, I'm not disappearing again. Not for you, not for safety, not for anyone. He looked at her from across the table, and for the first time since she'd walked into this room, his face was entirely unguarded, just for a moment, just long enough for her to see something underneath the control that looked startlingly like recognition. I know, he said. That's exactly why I've been looking for you for 8 months. She left the conference room and Marcus drove her back to Charlestown to pack. And the whole drive through the harbor tunnel, she pressed her hand to the side of her stomach and felt her child moving steady and insistent beneath her palm. And she thought, we are not furniture. We are not invisible. We are exactly who we are, and we are going to figure out what comes next. The afternoon was pale and cold, and the city spread out on all sides of her, and somewhere in a tower above the harbor, a man with a complicated history and his family's sins was making arrangements. He had promised not to make without her, and she did not know yet if she could trust him. But she knew this: he had been looking for her for 8 months, and he had told her the truth about her father, that she decided was enough to start with. By 5 o'clock, the movers Callum had sent 3 men in unmarked dark jackets, efficient and careful with her things, in a way that suggested either training or genuine respect for property, had transferred the contents of her apartment to the 41st floor suite of Reeve Tower. Her books had been arranged on shelves in the order they'd been packed, which meant they were out of her idiosyncratic organization system and would need to be resorted. Her drafting table, the wide-surfaced one she used for conservation work, had been positioned in the room's best light without her asking. The photograph of her father in his Port Authority hard hat, the one she kept on the kitchen windowsill in Charlestown, had been placed carefully on the new kitchen windowsill, without comment. She stood in the center of the suite and looked at the harbor through glass that was probably 2 inches thick, and thought about what her father would say if he could see her here. She thought he would ask, "Do you know what you're doing?" She thought she would tell him, "Not yet, but I know why." The suite had a separate bedroom, a sitting room with bookshelves, a kitchen she would probably not use as much as the building's chef, and a small room that she suspected was intended as a nursery, and which she was not yet ready to stand inside. The bathroom had a soaking tub that was probably the single most extravagant piece of infrastructure she had ever been in proximity to. A knock at the door. She opened it. Callum stood in the corridor jacket, gone now. Sleeves rolled up again in a way that was beginning to feel like his version of a white flag. He was holding 2 glasses of what she presumed was sparkling water. "Dinner," he said. "If you want." "You don't have to." She hesitated, then, "Yes." The kitchen was enormous, designed for the kind of scale that hosted business dinners for 12. Tonight it had been set for 2 at the corner of the long table where the light from the harbor came through without cutting into your eyes. The food was simple and excellent: pasta with brown butter and sage, a green salad bread that smelled of rosemary. Callum had made it himself, or mostly himself. There was a moment where she noticed the knife work was very precise, and the heat control was practiced, and she filed that detail alongside the others she was accumulating. They ate in silence for a while. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had already said a great deal and were resting inside the space of it. "Tell me something true," Mara said eventually. "Not about the situation, about you." He looked up. Something in his expression shifted, not to surprise exactly, but to that quality of recalibration she was beginning to recognize. "What kind of thing?" "Something I wouldn't find in a file." He considered this with apparent seriousness. "I've been trying to learn to sail again for 4 years, he said finally. "My grandfather taught me when I was a boy. I was reasonably competent at it. After my father's stroke, when I took over the company, I stopped going out. I've taken the boat out 3 times in the past 4 years, and each time I have the distinct sense that the boat is tolerating me rather than responding to me." He paused. "It's unsettling." Mara looked at him. "Is that a metaphor?" "It's also a literal boat." She found to her mild surprise that she was almost smiling. "Your turn." "The map," he said. "The one you stopped in front of last October. You said the harbor entrance had been altered. Were you right?" "Yes. Someone re-inked the channel depth markers, deepened the indicated approach by about 6 feet in the secondary entrance. It's a subtle change. You wouldn't notice it unless you were reading the map against actual survey records. Why would someone alter a 200-year-old chart? That depends on what the chart is being used for. She met his eyes. If it's decorative, no one cares. If someone is using it as evidence of historical navigation rights for a property claim for a waterway dispute, then altering the depth markers changes the argument. Callum was quiet for a moment. My family has an ongoing dispute with the state over secondary channel access rights in the outer harbor. The dispute is grounded in historical usage claims going back to the early 19th century, and a chart showing deeper navigation at the secondary entrance would support those claims. Yes. Is that your chart or your uncle's? The pause this time was different, shorter, more definite. My uncle's. He had it moved to my study 8 months ago when he said he needed the space in his office. Another pause, which was, I now realize the same week you began working in my building. They looked at each other across the table. He knew about me then, Mara said carefully. I don't know. He may have placed the chart as a provocation, an object connected to the harbor dispute, in a room he knew I'd see. Or it may be coincidence. Callum's jaw tightened. I don't believe much in coincidence where my uncle is concerned. Mara thought about this. She thought about the image of Bernard Reeve that she was assembling from pieces, a man in his mid-60s, 20 years, managing a criminal infrastructure comfortable with suppressed reports and obstructed inspections, and the specific kind of violence that looked like bureaucratic negligence. A man who had been running this empire on paper on behalf of a family member who hadn't known and who would not welcome a pregnant woman and the questions she might eventually ask. What does he know about tonight? She asked. About me moving in. By now, probably most of it. He has sources inside the building. Callum's voice was steady. Which is why I moved quickly. Whatever advantage we have is in the time before he decides how to respond. He'll respond. Yes? Then we should talk about what that looks like. Tomorrow? Callum said. Tonight I'd like to get through dinner without it becoming a strategic briefing. She looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that was asking something not for anything she wasn't prepared to give, but for a temporary suspension of the weight of it all. For 1 hour at a table with food and light and conversation that was something other than threat assessment. She thought, he is the man who told me I was remarkable and disappeared before dawn. He is the man whose family silenced my father. He is the man who spent 8 months looking for me. He is going to be the father of my child. He is all of these things simultaneously, and I do not know yet how to hold them all at once. She said, tell me about your grandfather's boat. He told her. It was a 38-foot sloop built in 1963, kept in a slip in Marblehead. His grandfather had sailed it every summer of his life until he was 81. Callum had learned on it from the age of 6 first as ballast, and then as crew, and then one summer at 14 as the primary sailor on a day trip to the outer islands, when his grandfather had developed a sudden and suspicious interest in sitting down and letting his grandson figure it out. He talked about the boat with a directness that he hadn't brought to anything else in the day's conversation, and Mara listened and felt something inside her chest doing something she hadn't given it permission to do. What's her name? Mara asked. The Patience, he said. She looked at him. My grandfather named her. A slight movement at the corner of his mouth. He was making a comment about my grandmother. This time she did smile. She couldn't help it. And across the table, Callum Reeve looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in the room. Not for the first time, not for the second time, and said nothing. And the harbor outside held the last of the evening light, and somewhere below them the city kept moving in all its complicated, unmanageable, irreversible momentum. It was, Mara thought, at least an honest beginning. The next morning began with a knock at 7:15. Mara had been awake since 5. The baby had her own relationship with time zones, apparently, and was sitting at the drafting table with a cup of tea reading through a stack of conservation notes she'd brought from Charlestown. The knock was soft, 2 beats, which she was already learning was how Callum indicated he was on the other side of a door, rather than Marcus or anyone from building staff. Come in. He was carrying a paper bag and 2 coffees. He was already dressed, the dark suit that controlled stillness, but there was something in his face that she hadn't seen yet. He had not, she thought, slept well. I have a meeting at 8, he said. I wanted to bring you this before I left. He set the bag on the kitchen table. Inside, pastries from a bakery she recognized as the one 2 blocks from her old apartment in Charlestown. I wasn't sure if you'd remember the address of a place near your old building, she said. I told you I'd been looking for you for 8 months. He said it simply without emphasis. I learned the neighborhood. She looked at the bag. She looked at him. She said, "That's either very thoughtful or quite alarming." "Probably both." He sat down across from her. "Dr. Huang can see you at 10:30 this morning. She's the best in New England for high-risk maternal care. Your pregnancy isn't technically high risk, I know that, but I wanted someone who could manage complexity if it arose. I'd like to meet her before I agree to switch providers." "Of course. Marcus can drive you, and—" He paused, something careful entering his expression. "Your mother, if you want to visit her today, if you want to tell her in person. I can arrange the transfer to St. Anne's on whatever timeline you decide, but I thought you should know the room is available whenever you're ready." Mara wrapped both hands around her tea. She had been awake since 5, thinking about her mother, about what to say about how you told a woman who had spent 4 years watching her daughter exhaust herself. 3 jobs, no sleep. Endless, careful management of money and time and energy. That actually there was a new plan, and the new plan involved living in a tower that belonged to a Reeve. "She'll know what the name means," Mara said. "I know." She grew up in East Boston. She knew dock workers. She went to the memorial when Pier 14 collapsed. Mara's voice stayed even by effort. "She knew what my father was doing in those last months. She watched him try." "I know," Callum said again. His voice was quiet and didn't flinch from it. "And you want to come with me when I tell her?" "Only if you'll allow it." He met her eyes. "She should be able to look at me, form her own opinion. She has more right to know who I am than almost anyone." Mara thought about this for a moment. She thought about her mother, Elena Voss, 61, former bookkeeper, current resident of a care facility that managed her post-stroke rehabilitation with competence and not much warmth, and about the intelligence in her mother's eyes that the stroke had not touched. Elena Voss did not miss much. "Come," she said, "but I talk first, alone, for as long as I need." Understood. He left for his meeting. Mara ate a pastry and watched the harbor and thought about the layers of this situation. She was still assembling the pregnancy, the tower, the uncle, her father's report, the altered map. She had been a conservator long enough to understand that damage was never simple, that what looked like a single tear in old parchment was usually the result of multiple overlapping stresses, each one compounding the others, and that proper restoration required understanding all of them before you touched anything. She was not sure what proper restoration looked like here, but she was beginning to understand the damage. Dr. Patricia Huang was in her late 40s, meticulous, and had the quality of unhurried attention that Mara associated with people who had learned to do the important things very well and let everything else wait. She conducted the appointment with efficiency and warmth, in equal measure ran the ultrasound herself, and narrated everything she was seeing in a voice calibrated for someone who wanted to understand rather than simply be reassured. 24 weeks, she said, watching the screen. Good position, good movement, heartbeat strong. She pointed to a small rhythmic flicker. Growth's tracking well. You've been managing stress levels with what exactly? Work, Mara said. Routine, cleaning things that were dirty. Dr. Huang made a note. And exercise. Walking, I walk a lot. Keep doing that. Prenatal yoga if you're open to it. I can recommend someone. She looked up from the screen. Mr. Reeve called me last night at nearly midnight. He asked a comprehensive set of questions about the second trimester. He had clearly done some reading beforehand because his follow-up questions were good. A measured pause. He asked specifically about stress-induced complications and about what the research says on prenatal awareness, whether an infant in utero is responsive to the emotional state of people around them. Mara looked at the ceiling. That's a very Callum question. He seems like someone who prefers to understand the mechanism. The doctor clicked off the ultrasound. I'm telling you because I think it's useful for you to know that the man has done his homework and is taking this seriously. In my experience, that information matters. Your experience with Crime Dynasty's prenatal care, Dr. Huang smiled slightly. My experience with powerful men deciding to be fathers. Some treat it as an acquisition. Some treat it as a threat to manage. A few treat it as something that actually changes them. She handed Mara a printout of the ultrasound. It's early, but I thought you should know what I'm observing. Mara drove to Winthrop Care with Marcus at the wheel and the ultrasound image in her bag and the word changes sitting somewhere in her chest like a small, unverified thing. Her mother was in the common room when Mara arrived, doing a puzzle with another resident, and the look on Elena's face when she saw her daughter was the specific look Mara had known her whole life, sharp and warm and preemptively worried. You look tired, her mother said, which was how Elena Voss said something's wrong in a room where she didn't want other people to hear. They found a private corner. Mara sat down. She pulled the ultrasound image from her bag and put it on the table between them. Her mother looked at it for a long time. How far along? Elena asked in a voice that was entirely steady. 24 weeks. The father is complicated. Mara met her mother's eyes. He's someone I met before I knew who he was. He has a false name he uses sometimes. I found out the truth after. She paused. His real name is Callum Reeve. The blood left her mother's face. Mama. I heard you. Elena Voss put one hand flat on the table. She had the deliberateness of someone exercising discipline over a very strong reaction. I heard you. Give me a moment. Mara waited. He's the one moving me, Elena said finally. It was not a question. The transfer papers they showed me this morning, the new facility, that was him. He arranged it. I'm going to make sure it feels like your choice, not an arrangement over your head. But yes, to St. Anne's. Yes. Elena was quiet again. Outside the window, the November grounds of Winthrop Care were gray and bare, the paths between buildings empty in the cold. Her mother was looking at the ultrasound image with an expression Mara couldn't quite read. Your father, Elena said. He spent 2 years. I know. He spent the last year of his life trying to prove that Doc was negligent, that someone covered it up. And the name on the Doc operations was... I know, Mama. Mara's voice was careful. I know all of that. I knew it when I took the job at the tower. I knew the Reeve name. I didn't connect Callum to the Doc until he told me himself. He told you? Yesterday morning. He's been building a case. Against his uncle, it was his uncle who suppressed the reports, not Callum himself. Callum didn't know until 3 years ago when he took over the company and did an internal audit. She held her mother's gaze. I know how that sounds. I'm not asking you to trust him. I'm not sure I trust him yet. But he told me the truth. And he told me it without being asked, and that's... She stopped. That's something. Her mother looked at her daughter with the direct, unsentimental attention that had always been Elena Voss's most useful trait. She looked at her for a long time. He's coming, Elena said. To meet me. He asked to. He's waiting outside. Bring him in. Callum entered the common room with the particular quality of a man who understood that the power dynamics in this space were not his to control. He was quieter here than he was anywhere Mara had seen him, not diminished, but adjusted the way a person adjusts their pitch in a room with different acoustics. He introduced himself to Elena without his surname, which Mara noted. He sat when Elena indicated a chair not before. Mr. Reeve, Elena said. Mrs. Voss. He met her eyes. I'm grateful you'll see me. Grateful. Elena repeated the word flatly. My daughter is carrying your child. She's been hiding it from you for 5 months. And you want to be grateful for a conversation. I'm aware that gratitude is a limited response to this situation. His voice was steady. I don't have a more adequate one. My husband spent the last year of his life trying to get someone in your family's organization to acknowledge what happened to Pier 14. Elena's voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. He filed safety reports. He escalated. He went around the Port Authority to the state, and every single path closed. Yes. Callum did not deflect it. He held the weight of it. I know. He died 4 months after the collapse. I know. Do you know what that looks like? Watching someone try to do the right thing and hit a wall every time. Watching someone who spent 20 years doing honest work get told that his work didn't matter, that the report didn't matter, that 3 men's deaths didn't matter. No, Callum said quietly. I don't know what it looks like. I know what caused it. I know the specific mechanism by which his reports were intercepted and killed. I know the names of the people involved. He paused. And I intend to do something about that. Not because it fixes anything it doesn't, but because it's the only action left that has any meaning. Elena looked at him. Her expression was not warm. It was assessing the look of a woman who had been watching people for 60 years and had learned to read them without giving them the gift of knowing she was reading. You're not going to fix my daughter's life by being better than your family, she said finally, and you're not going to earn my forgiveness by putting me in a nice room. What I want to know, what I need to know, is whether you're going to use your power over her, whether having the money and the name and the building means you think you can tell her what her life looks like. I've already tried to arrange things without asking her, Callum said. She corrected me, clearly. Something moved in his face that was almost rueful. She is not a woman who allows herself to be arranged.
No, Elena agreed. She is not.
The two of them looked at each other across the small table in the common room of Winthrop Care, and Mara watched the calculus happening behind her mother's eyes. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but the careful extension of provisional judgment. She needs someone who helps her carry things, Elena said finally, not someone who takes them from her because he thinks he can carry them better. I understand the distinction, Callum said. Understanding it and doing it are different. Elena turned to look at her daughter. You'll come see me at the new place before the week is out. Of course. And you'll eat something. You look like you've lost weight since September. Elena's voice softened slightly. The shift from assessment to mothering, which in Elena Voss were not entirely separate operations. The baby needs more than anxiety. The baby's fine, Mama. Dr. Huang says she's perfectly on track. Elena looked at the ultrasound image still on the table. We don't know yet, Mara said. I keep saying she. I don't know why. Elena Voss looked at the image for a long moment. Something moved across her face that was private, in particular, the way strong feeling sometimes is when it's had long enough to become something more than feeling. Your father would have wanted a granddaughter, she said. He always said he was better with daughters. Mara felt the tightening in her throat that she had been managing for most of the morning. She reached across the table and took her mother's hand, and for a moment they were just the two of them in the specific grief of women who have lost someone they built themselves around and have had to learn slowly and incompletely to build around his absence instead. Callum, she noticed when she looked up, had moved to stand by the window. He was looking out at the gray November grounds with his back to them, and he had given them the room which was either natural sensitivity or learned consideration, and she was not sure yet which it was, and she thought it might not matter. They drove back to the tower in late afternoon, and Marcus took the long route along the waterfront, whether by instruction or habit. Mara didn't ask. The harbor was steel-colored in the November light, the container ships moving with that same vast, unhurried mass. And she looked at the water and thought about her father in his Port Authority vest, walking these docks and writing his reports and trying. Tell me about the documents, she said. Callum looked at her. They were sitting side by side in the back of the Range Rover. A careful space between them and the city outside was beginning to go amber with late light. Which documents? The ones you found during the audit. My father's reports. What you actually have. A pause. You're sure you want this now? I've been waiting 4 years. I want it now. He was quiet for a moment. Then, 3 suppressed reports filed by your father between November 2018 and August 2019. Each routed through the Port Liaison Office, a subsidiary compliance body that was formally independent but operationally connected to Reeve Maritime Services, the holding company under which Pier 14 operated. Each flagged to my uncle's desk and closed without forwarding to state regulators. He spoke evenly without editorializing. I have the routing records. I have the flagging notations, which include a handwritten annotation on the 3rd report, your father's final filing, that reads, "Manage this, do not escalate." The handwriting is my uncle's. Mara breathed. I also have the communications between my uncle's office and the Port Liaison Coordinator for the 2 months following the Pier 14 collapse. There are 11 emails discussing the management of accident liability and the suppression of the inspection records that would have corroborated your father's reports. He paused. The families of the 3 workers who died received a settlement through an insurance intermediary. The settlement included a standard non-disclosure clause and was structured to obscure the Reeve family's connection to the dock operations. He bought their silence. He purchased legal protection, Callum said. Which is not the same thing morally, but is the same thing practically. Mara looked out the window at the harbor. She thought about 3 dead dock workers and their families living with NDAs and settlements and the particular silence that comes when you've been paid to stop asking. She thought about her father, who had not been paid, who had not been offered settlement, who had simply been outmaneuvered until his questions ran out of road. What are you going to do with it? She asked. I've been in contact with the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts for the past 18 months, Callum said. Through an intermediary, an attorney who handles federal compliance matters. I have not yet turned over the documents. I've been building the evidentiary package to ensure that when I do, the case is complete enough to result in charges rather than a civil settlement. He paused. The timeline I had projected was another 8 to 10 months. And now the timeline has changed. His voice was careful. Because you exist. Because Bernard will eventually know about you if he doesn't already. Because you're connected to the Pier 14 matter in a way that gives him every incentive to move against you before I can move against him. How does me existing threaten him? Because if you connect the dots between your father's work and the Reeve organization's liability, which you're clearly in the process of doing, and if you go to the press or the U.S. attorney or anyone before I've had a chance to structure the cooperation agreement properly, the case becomes messier. Bernard's lawyers will argue competing narratives. The suppression of the reports becomes a dispute between witnesses rather than a documented chain of command. He met her eyes. You are not a threat to him because you're dangerous by yourself. You're a threat because you're uncontrolled. He will want to control you or remove you from the equation. The car moved through the tunnel. The harbor disappeared behind them and the city rose up on both sides. What does remove mean? Mara said flatly. In his operating history, it has meant legal intimidation, financial pressure, the sudden unavailability of employment references, and in 2 cases I'm aware of more direct intervention. Callum's jaw was tight. It has not historically meant physical harm. He prefers mechanisms that are harder to trace. A pause. But you would be the first person in his way who was also pregnant with his nephew's child, and I don't have a precedent for how he calculates that. How close are you, Mara asked. Realistically, to having enough for the U.S. attorney, 6 to 8 weeks, if nothing destabilizes the process. Then we need to make sure nothing does. He looked at her. You're thinking about it like a case. I'm a conservator, she said. Everything I do is about stabilizing damaged material so it can survive long enough to be properly examined. I know how to protect evidence. I know how to work with a timeline. She met his eyes. Tell me what you need from me to close the gap. The car came up from the tunnel into the evening light of the harbor district, and Reeve Tower was visible 3 blocks ahead, its glass face reflecting the last of the day's color. And Callum Reeve looked at the woman beside him with the same expression she'd seen in the conference room that morning, the one that looked underneath the control, like recognition. You'd be willing to do that, he said. It was not quite a question. My father spent the last year of his life trying to get someone to listen, Mara said. I'm not going to spend the next 6 weeks waiting in a tower while you and your lawyers figure out how to use what he built. She held his gaze. Tell me what you need. That night, Mara did not sleep easily, but the insomnia was productive rather than anxious. She lay in the large bed of the 41st floor suite and organized what she knew into a structure she could work with the way she organized a complex conservation project. Primary damage, secondary damage, load-bearing elements, points of fragility. Sequence of intervention. Primary damage. Bernard Reeve. The suppressed reports 3 dead workers, her father's eroded last year. Secondary damage. Callum's inheritance of an empire built on things he hadn't chosen, the years of not knowing, and then of knowing, but not yet acting, the gap between what he'd inherited and what he was trying to become. Load-bearing elements. The documents, the routing records, the handwritten annotation, the cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office that was still 6 weeks away. Points of fragility. Her own visibility, which had just increased dramatically. The baby who was now known to exist. Marcus and whatever building staff reported to Bernard's sources. The timeline which was now compressed in ways that neither she nor Callum had anticipated 3 days ago. She pressed her palm against her stomach and felt the small, definite movements of her child and thought, we need 6 more weeks. 8 months of hiding, and we need 6 more weeks. The harbor was very dark outside. She could see the navigation lights of a ship moving slowly through the channel, red and green and white, the old language of approach and intent, of who you were and where you were going and which side you were asking to pass on. Her father had known that language. He had spent 20 years reading the harbor and writing down what he saw. She thought, I know how to read damaged things. I know how to stabilize them. I know what questions to ask. It was almost enough to let her sleep. At 2 a.m, her phone lit up. A text from an unfamiliar number that she quickly realized was Callum's personal line, rather than the formal channel he'd been using. Bernard called me tonight. He knows you exist. He doesn't know the full connection to your father yet. He will within 48 hours. She stared at the screen. Then she typed back, what do you need me to do tomorrow? 3 minutes passed. Nothing dangerous, just I'll tell you in the morning. Are you all right? She considered this. The question was so stripped of the careful, formal architecture of how he usually communicated that it landed differently than she expected. It was just a question. Just a man at 2 in the morning asking if she was all right. I'm awake and thinking, she typed. The baby is also awake and thinking apparently, what are you thinking about? My father's reports. The sequence of intervention. What we do with 48 hours. A pause. Then I'm thinking about those things too. Also about the patients and whether she'd hold up if I had to sail somewhere fast. Mara stared at the message. She thought about a 38-foot sloop in Marblehead. She thought about a man who hadn't sailed in 4 years because he'd been managing an inherited empire and discovering its crimes and trying to figure out how to dismantle it without losing everything. Where would you go? She typed. Anywhere you wanted. She set the phone down. The harbor lights moved in the channel outside. The baby settled into a quieter rhythm. She did not know yet what she felt. She knew what she was afraid of being wrong about, him being naive about what his promises could hold, making a decision about her daughter's life based on late-night texts and the way he looked at damaged maps. She knew what she was hoping for, which was something more complicated and more dangerous than being afraid. She picked the phone back up. You'll have to learn to sail properly first, she typed, before you take anyone anywhere. The response came quickly. That's fair. She set the phone back down. The harbor held its lights. The city held its breath. She thought 6 weeks. We need 6 weeks. She thought he was looking for me for 8 months. She thought my father built a case that someone buried, and now I'm going to finish it. She closed her eyes and the baby moved once more, deliberate and insistent, and she fell asleep. 2 days passed in the layered tension of waiting. Mara established a routine because routine was what she knew how to use mornings with her conservation notes and the growing archive of documents Callum began to share with her, redacted at first, then less so, as whatever calculation he was running about her resolved in her favor. She read the routing records from the port liaison office with the focused attention she gave to damaged paper, following the chain of notation and forwarding and deliberate omission, the way she followed the stress fractures in old vellum, slowly, completely, without allowing herself to reach conclusions before the evidence was full. Her father's handwriting was on 3 of the reports. She recognized it, his precise, somewhat old-fashioned notation, the careful underlining of structural metrics, the measured language of a man who had spent 20 years filing reports and knew that the value of a report was in its specificity, its traceability, its refusal to be dismissed as opinion. He had known how to build a case. He had built one. He had just not known that the building it went into was the one that would bury it. She did not let herself cry over this. She filed it in the load-bearing category. Her father's work was evidence, and evidence had to be protected, and you did not protect it by falling apart in front of it. Callum came to dinner each evening. They had fallen into this without quite discussing it. He would appear at the suite around 7 sometimes, with food from Rosa in the kitchen, sometimes with a quiet suggestion that they eat at the main table, and they would spend 2 hours in conversation that was somewhere between negotiation and the thing that comes after negotiation, where you stop performing your position and start simply talking. She learned things about him in these evenings that she filed alongside the documents that he read. History, obsessively, particularly maritime history, and could talk about the economics of the 18th century Atlantic trade for an hour without repeating himself. That he was a genuinely poor cook, except for pasta, which he made very well. That he had a specific tell when he was choosing his words carefully. A brief stillness in his hands, a slight flattening of his expression, the faintest pause before the sentence came. She cataloged all of it. He learned things about her, too. She could see him doing it the same quality of attention, the same quiet accumulation. That she organized her thoughts spatially, which was why she needed her drafting table and not a desk. That she had strong opinions about paper, specifically about the moral failure of cheap paper, which he found both specific and unreasonable. That she could sit in silence for long periods without discomfort, which he appeared to find restful. "You're not what I expected," he said on the 3rd evening, which was when Bernard's deadline had come and gone, and whatever he was going to do with the information about Mara had been set in motion. "What did you expect?" "Someone more afraid," he considered, "or more angry." "I'm both," she said. "I've had practice keeping them where they're useful." He looked at her. "Your father taught you that." "My father and the job. You can't be afraid of damaged material. You just have to understand it well enough to work with it." She met his eyes. "I've decided to think of this situation as a particularly complex conservation project." That's a very controlled way to describe a pregnancy and a criminal conspiracy. "I'm a controlled person." "You're an extraordinary person." He said it the way he'd written it in the note, simply without performance. The first time I heard you talk about that chart, I thought I've never met anyone who knows exactly what they know and says it that directly. Most people find directness inconvenient. I find it clarifying. They were sitting at the corner of the long table where the harbor light came through without cutting, and the city was settling into its evening rhythms outside, and Mara was aware of the specific quality of this moment, how it would look from the outside versus how it felt from the inside, and how those two things were not yet aligned in a way she knew how to name. Bernard called my attorney today, Callum said, shifting register in the way she was learning to recognize the pivot from personal to strategic, which he did, with a kind of effortful cleanness, like someone who'd practiced separating the two. He's offered to buy the Pier 14 liability. He wants to create a settlement structure that absorbs the historical exposure before anyone goes to the U.S. attorney. Mara was still. He knows about the U.S. attorney. He knows I've been in contact with someone in that office. He doesn't know the scope of the case. Callum's jaw was tight. He's offering me cover a legal settlement that would technically discharge the family liability and make the criminal exposure much more difficult to prosecute. In exchange for what? For dropping the cooperation agreement, for folding the case back into the family, and letting 3 families keep their NDAs and their settlements and live in the particular silence of people who were paid to stop asking questions. Mara's voice was even. And letting my father's report stay buried.
Yes. Callum looked at her. I told my attorney I needed 24 hours to consider the offer.
You don't need 24 hours.
I know. A pause.
I needed to tell you about it first. She looked at him. The harbor outside was very wide and very still in the evening light, and somewhere in Marblehead, a 38-foot sloop named the Patience was sitting in her slip, and Mara thought about what it meant that this man had called her father's case to her attention, and then come to dinner to tell her what his uncle was offering. You're not going to take it, she said.
No.
Then you don't need my input. You need to call your attorney.
I know.
He didn't move. I wanted to tell you because your father's work is part of this, because you should know what I'm choosing. Mara looked at this man across the table, the man who had given her a false name and then spent 8 months trying to correct the omission, who was sitting here refusing a settlement that would have protected him and his family, because 3 dock workers' families lived with NDAs, and her father had spent his last months trying who was choosing deliberately costly at risk to himself to finish what Daniel Voss had started. She said, call your attorney. He called. She listened to his side of it, precise, unequivocal, the same controlled voice she'd heard in the corridor that first night when he'd given an employee 48 hours to run. No settlement, no liability absorption. The cooperation agreement stands. When he hung up, the room was quiet.
He'll move against you now, Mara said. Bernard, if you turn down the settlement, he'll know the case is real.
Yes. Callum set the phone down. We have a problem.
Tell me.
One of my building staff reported your presence to Bernard 2 days ago. Not just that you exist, but that you're the daughter of Daniel Voss. He's had that information for 48 hours. He met her eyes. He called my attorney with the settlement offer because he was trying to determine whether I knew the connection. Now he knows I do. And he knows I'm not settling.
What does he do next?
He has 3 options. Callum's voice was steady and analytical the way it got when he was working through logistics. He tries to discredit your father's reports, retroactively claim they were incomplete biased filed incorrectly. That's the legal strategy. It's slow, and it won't work because the documents are clean. He tries to remove you from the picture, find something to use against you, pressure your employment, isolate you from the cooperation agreement process. Or, he stopped. Or, Mara said, he comes to you directly. Tries to offer you the same thing he offered me. Settlement, money. A narrative that makes your father's death a tragedy rather than a consequence. His eyes were on hers. He's going to make you an offer, Mara, in the next 48 hours. Something large enough that you'd have to think about it. She thought about that for a moment. He doesn't know me, she said.
No.
Then let him make the offer. She held Callum's gaze. And when he does, I'll be wearing a wire and your attorney will be listening. The silence in the room was absolute. Callum stared at her. That's... He stopped. Started again. You understand what that requires. You'd have to meet with him. Alone, essentially, I can't be there. You'd be visibly pregnant and in a room with a man who considers you a liability. I'm a conservator, Mara said. I spend my professional life handling things that could destroy themselves if managed badly. I know how to be in the room with something dangerous and keep my hands steady. She paused. And my father spent a year trying to get someone to hear what he knew. I'm not going to get this close to the end and hand it off. Callum was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Something that was not managed, not strategic, not the careful presentation of a man in control of his situation. Something raw and complicated and honest underneath everything. I'm not going to let you walk into that meeting, he said. You said equal standing. Equal standing isn't, tell me how it's different, she said. Tell me why you deciding what risks I take is different from your uncle deciding what reports get suppressed. Tell me the distinction. The silence stretched. It's different, he said finally, because I know what he's capable of, and you've never been in that room. Then tell me what he's capable of, so I go in knowing. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. You're serious, he said. My father built the case, Mara said. I'm going to close it, with you or despite you, but I'd prefer with you. Outside the window, the harbor lights were coming on one by one, marking the channel in the dark. The old language of approach and intent, of who you were and what you were asking for. Callum Reeve looked at the woman across from him and said very quietly, "Then we do it together." They spent the next hour and a half working through it at the dining table with Callum's attorney on speakerphone, a woman named Adele Marsh, who had the clipped efficiency of someone who had handled federal cooperation agreements before and found dramatic pauses professionally wasteful. She walked Mara through the wire protocol, the legal parameters, the specific language that would make Bernard's offer legally actionable, and the physical safety considerations that she delivered in the flat register of someone reciting a list rather than attempting to frighten. He won't do anything physical in a public meeting, Adele said. He's a lawyer's animal. He likes mechanisms. What he'll try to do is assess your leverage, what you know, what Callum's told you, whether you can be separated from the cooperation agreement by money or fear. A pause. He doesn't know about the documents you've been reviewing. He doesn't know your father's reports are part of the evidentiary package. When he finds that out, and he will the moment he offers you a settlement, and you don't immediately say yes, he'll recalibrate. What does recalibration look like? Mara asked. Faster movement on the legal containment strategy. More pressure on Callum to withdraw. Possibly an attempt to challenge the cooperation agreement itself by claiming the family isn't properly represented. Adele's voice was dry. He's going to be very unpleasant, but unpleasant and dangerous aren't the same thing. After the call ended, the room was quiet. Callum had his elbows on the table and was looking at the surface in front of him with the expression she associated with his version of very focused thought. Adele has done this before, Mara said. 17 federal cooperation agreements over 30 years. He looked up. She also handled my first meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office. She knows how this works. Then we're set. Mara. His voice was different, not strategic, personal. She looked at him. If anything goes wrong, if the meeting shifts in a direction that feels wrong, if he says anything that makes you feel unsafe, you leave. You don't wait for the wire to be useful. You leave. His eyes were very direct. I will have Marcus within 100 feet of wherever the meeting happens. If you need out, you say any version of my name. He'll hear it, and he'll be at your side in under 30 seconds. You're going to spend the entire meeting listening on the wire, aren't you? Obviously. No apology in his voice. I'm not going to pretend that's neutral. You can be angry about it if you want. Mara considered this. She thought about a man who had been trying to control uncontrollable things for 8 years, and who was being asked to sit in a car 100 feet away while the woman carrying his child sat across from his uncle. I'm not angry, she said. I do the same. Something in his face settled, not relief exactly, but the particular steadiness of a weight that had been set down carefully. Get some sleep, he said. Bernard will reach out tomorrow. She stood. He stood. They were at the awkward geography of an ending that didn't quite know its own form yet, not the way that conversations end between people who are simply colleagues, but not the way they end between people who have resolved anything either. They were somewhere in between, in the country of two people who were building trust out of something that had started without it, in the halting and effortful way that honest things get built. Callum. She used his name deliberately, the way she'd started doing, as a way of making contact rather than maintaining distance. He looked at her. Thank you for not taking the settlement, she said. For my father. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of management entirely. I should have found those reports 3 years ago. I should have moved faster. I should have... He stopped himself. There's a version of this where I did this better. There's a version of most things where someone did it better. She met his eyes. You're doing it now. That matters. She went to her suite. She lay in the wide bed and listened to the harbor and felt her daughter moving in the deliberate way she'd been moving lately. Larger now, more present, less like a whisper, and more like a person. She thought Bernard will call tomorrow. She thought I know how to be in a room with something that could damage itself and keep my hand steady. She thought Callum is 100 feet away. She thought that's enough. Bernard Reeve called at 11 the following morning. His voice was not what Mara had expected. She had been imagining something harder, more explicitly menacing, the voice of a man who had spent 20 years running a criminal infrastructure and was comfortable with it. Instead, he was mild, professionally warm, with the particular register of a Boston institutional man, Harvard divinity, or Suffolk law. She thought someone who had learned that the most dangerous rooms were the ones with the most polished manners. "Ms. Voss," he said, "I hope you're comfortable in the building. My nephew takes his hospitality seriously." "He does," she agreed. She was at her drafting table, the wire taped flat under her shirt, and she kept her voice easy. "I'd like to meet with you," Bernard said. "Informally. I have a feeling we have more in common than you might expect." "I'm open to that. There's a restaurant on the seaport I like. Oyster Bar on Congress. Tomorrow at noon." She said yes. She hung up. Callum was in the doorway within 2 minutes. She had left her suite door open, which she was learning was the signal between them for "you can come in." He was looking at her with the particular controlled tension of a man who had just finished listening to a phone call from 2 rooms away and was managing the effort of not saying anything protective. "He's smoother than you made him sound," she said. "He's had 30 years to practice." Callum moved to the table, looked at her notes. "Oyster Bar on Congress is a good choice for him. It's busy at noon, good ambient noise, any conversation can be explained as business, and the layout means there's no vantage point where Marcus can watch without being obvious. Can he be close enough to hear? With the wire, yes. He'll be 2 tables away with a newspaper." A pause. "In plain clothes. He looks significantly less alarming in plain clothes." Mara almost smiled. "That's a low bar. Marcus is a very alarming person." Callum pulled a chair to the edge of the drafting table, not sitting at it, just near which was the spatial grammar he'd developed for being present without crowding. "How do you feel?" "Fine. Organized." She met his eyes. "The same way I feel before I open a really complex piece, like I need to know the structure before I touch anything." He looked at her for a moment. "Bernard is going to tell you that your father's reports were filed improperly, that the routing process was technically correct under the existing Port Authority protocols. He's going to argue that the Pier 14 collapse was a structural failure, that the inspection records don't actually connect to your father's assessment. He's going to lie. Fluently." Callum's voice was dry. "He is extremely good at constructing technically accurate statements that create a false impression. His particular skill is the sentence that is true in isolation and misleading in context." I know that kind of argument. Mara thought about the altered harbor chart in the flat file. "I've seen it in document disputes. Someone changes one measurement, puts it in a technically accurate context, and suddenly the historical record looks like it supports something it doesn't." Callum looked at her. Something moved in his face. "That's exactly how he thinks. Then I know how to listen to him." She held his gaze. "I don't just need to hear what he says. I need to hear what he assumes I don't know. What he thinks is still hidden." A pause. "What do you mean?" "If he offers me a settlement structured around your father's liability, if he uses language about the Pier 14 event specifically that tells me what he thinks is still buried, what he thinks I haven't seen." She paused. "What we haven't shown the U.S. attorney yet." Callum was looking at her with the expression she associated with his version of being surprised by something, a very slight reconfiguration, an almost imperceptible stillness, as if he'd revised a calculation mid-step. "You're going to use the offer as a probe," he said. "That's what my father was doing when he filed the 3rd report," she said. "He wasn't just filing for the record, he was forcing someone to respond. He was using their response to map who was protecting what." She looked at the document spread on her drafting table. "He knew the report would be suppressed. He filed it anyway because he wanted the suppression documented." A long silence. "Your father was smarter than most federal investigators I've worked with," Callum said quietly. "He was a harbor inspector for 22 years. Her voice was steady and private at the same time. He knew every crack in every dock and every person who had an interest in those cracks not being reported. He built his case very carefully. She looked up. And then someone made sure it didn't matter. It's going to matter, Callum said. I promise you that. She believed him. She did not yet know everything that meant what it would cost him, what it would require, how far the distance was between a man who had inherited an empire and a man who could dismantle it, but she believed the intention was real. That was enough to work with.
Papa.
The oyster bar on Congress was exactly as Callum had described, loud, with the productive noise of a lunch crowd lit in the particular warm amber way of expensive casual rooms, the kind of place where business conversations happened inside the cover of celebration. Mara arrived 4 minutes early. Marcus was already at a table near the bar reading the Globe in clothes that were almost convincing. Bernard Reeve was already there. He was 63. She'd learned Callum's father's younger brother, raised in the same milieu of old Boston money and harbor access. He was trim in a way that suggested discipline rather than ease, with silver hair worn short and the particular physical self-possession of men who have operated in power for long enough that they've stopped performing it. He stood when she approached and shook her hand with genuine warmth. Ms. Voss, thank you for coming. He gestured to the seat across from him. You're further along than I expected. 26 weeks. My nephew's been keeping me somewhat removed from the details. A smile that was perfectly calibrated, paternal, unbothered. How are you feeling? Well, she said. She ordered water from the passing server and settled into the chair and let the room settle around her. The wire was taped below her collarbone. She could feel it if she thought about it, so she stopped thinking about it. Bernard ordered wine. He talked about the restaurant he'd been coming here for 20 years. It had changed 3 times, but the oysters were still correct. He talked about the November weather and the harbor in winter, and a series of remarks about Boston that were clearly intended to establish a shared reference, a sense of common ground. He was very good at it. She could see why Callum said 30 years. I knew your father, Bernard said, in the particular way people say things they want to seem like an aside. By reputation, at least. He was very thorough, very conscientious. He cared about his work. He did, Mara said. A terrible loss. Bernard's voice was exactly what it should be measured, respectful, the appropriate weight. I've thought about the Pier 14 accident many times over the years. It was a structural failure, very complex, very hard to trace the causation. There it is, she thought. Structural failure. Not negligence. Not suppressed reports. Was it? She said. Bernard looked at her, a fractional pause, a slight recalibration. He had expected either grief or compliance, she thought. Not a question. The investigation established that the load-bearing issues were below the detectable threshold at the time of the most recent inspection, he said. It was a tragedy that the failure happened when it did. My father's assessment established the structural deficiencies 11 months before the collapse, Mara said. Her voice was completely even. He filed it with the Port Authority in November of 2018, with the Massport Liaison Office 3 months later, with the State Safety Authority in April of 2019. A brief silence. She watched Bernard not react, the specific non-reaction of a man who has practiced exactly this. I'm aware of your father's filings, he said carefully. The routing of those reports through the appropriate channels was complex. Port Authority compliance structures in that period were, the reports were flagged to the Reeve Maritime Liaison Desk, Mara said. The first 2 were closed within 48 hours. The third had a handwritten annotation manage this do not escalate. She held his gaze. I've read the annotation. I know the handwriting. The room noise carried on around them. Conversations, glasses, the rhythm of a busy lunch service. And at a table near the bar, Marcus was turning a page of the Globe, and somewhere in a car on Congress Street, Callum was listening to every word of this, and Bernard Reeve was sitting very still, with the particular stillness of a man who has just understood the size of what he is looking at. I see, he said. You called me here to offer a settlement, Mara said. I'd like to hear the offer. Bernard looked at her for a moment. The warmth was still there, professionally maintained, but underneath it something had shifted into the calculating register. He was revising, running scenarios. She could almost see him doing it. Your father's work deserves recognition, he said. There are families, the workers' families, who have received compensation, but it was structured in a way that doesn't acknowledge the specifics of the causation. I'd like to correct that. I'd like to create a named foundation in Daniel Voss's memory, endowed with a figure that would allow meaningful programs in harbor safety and dock worker welfare. $5 million to start.
Mara did not move. She kept her hands flat on the table. She thought he's offering money and a foundation in my father's name to buy me away from a federal case. She thought my father would find this very nearly funny. What does that settlement require from me? She asked.
A statement clarifying the scope of your father's reports, acknowledging the limitations of the data available to him at the time, and a general release of liability against Reeve Maritime Services and its subsidiaries. He paused. It would also include substantial personal compensation. I understand your mother's care is significant. There would be a trust established for your child. And the workers' families, their NDAs, those are separate agreements. A pause. But modifications could be discussed. Modifications, Mara said. Adjustments to the confidentiality provisions that would allow a broader acknowledgement of, you're offering to let them start asking questions again, Mara said. As long as I stop asking mine. The smile was still on his face. It was not in his eyes. Ms. Voss, he said. You're a documents conservator. You work with old complex materials. You understand that context changes the interpretation of evidence. Your father filed reports based on information that was incomplete in certain respects. The full picture of the Pier 14 situation is more nuanced than those reports reflect. Is there a document that establishes that nuance? Mara asked. Something that supersedes the routing records. Something that explains the handwritten annotation. A longer pause this time. This conversation, Bernard said carefully, is one we're having in good faith, as family, as people with a shared interest in. We are not family, Mara said. She said it without heat, just as a correction of a false premise. We share a building currently. That's different. Bernard looked at her. She looked back at him. She thought about her father at a desk in East Boston at 2 a.m, with his reports and his certainty and his knowledge that the path was being closed in front of him, and she thought he would have liked this. He would have found it clarifying. I can't accept your offer, she said. Miss Voss, I can't accept it because it's designed to remove me from a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office that documents the full chain of evidence, including the handwritten annotation, including the intercepted escalation paths, including the NDA settlements, as part of a coordinated liability suppression strategy. She held his gaze. I can't accept it because the full record needs to exist. For the dock workers' families, for my father's work, for the 3 men who died. A pause. I think you already knew I would say this. I think you brought me here to assess how much I knew, and now you know. Bernard was very still. You've been talking to my nephew, he said. Yes. He's going to destroy this family. He's going to complete the work my father started, Mara said. That's not the same thing as destruction. That's accountability. The silence between them lasted 4 or 5 seconds, long enough to have a texture. Then Bernard Reeve sat back in his chair with a slowness that was itself a kind of statement, and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just revised his assessment of a situation dramatically. You're more than he told me, Bernard said. He didn't tell you anything about me, Mara said. You made assumptions. Bernard almost smiled. She could see it, the involuntary acknowledgement of something he hadn't expected to find before the control reasserted itself. You understand this isn't going to be simple. What Callum is doing. The exposure to this family, to the people who depend on this organization. I understand that 3 workers' families have spent years living with NDAs, and the knowledge that no one was held responsible. Mara's voice was even and absolute. That's the exposure that matters to me. She stood. Tell your attorney, she said, that the cooperation agreement is proceeding, and tell your legal team to start reading the case for the settlement Adele Marsh has been authorized to offer Reeve Maritime in exchange for cooperation. It's a better outcome for everyone involved than a criminal trial. She picked up her bag, including you. She walked out of the oyster bar into the November cold, and Marcus was beside her before she reached the sidewalk, and 2 blocks away, a black Range Rover pulled to the curb, and Callum was out of the car before it stopped. He didn't say anything. He put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her face, and she could see what it had cost him an hour sitting in a car listening to his uncle offer her money and talk about her father. I'm all right, she said. I know. His hands were steady. I just needed to... He stopped. I know, she said. They stood on the sidewalk in the November cold with the harbor 2 blocks south and the city moving around them in its indifferent continuous way. And he kept his hands on her shoulders, as if she was something he needed to make sure was real, and she let him because she understood what the hour had cost, and because she thought she understood what she was beginning to mean to him, and she was not quite ready yet to say the corresponding thing out loud, but she was closer to it than she had been yesterday. He knows the full scope now, she said. He knows we have the annotation. Yes, Callum's voice was controlled. He'll move faster. Then we move faster. She met his eyes. Call Adele. Tell her we need the cooperation agreement finalized by end of week. He looked at her. That's 2 weeks ahead of schedule. I know. The package won't be as complete as... Adele said 17 federal cooperation agreements over 30 years, Mara said. She knows what's sufficient to file. Ask her. A pause. Then very quietly, you're extraordinary. She had heard him say it before in a note in a conference room. This time it landed differently. This time it was not a thing he had said in wonder or in the careful performance of a man trying to establish trust. It was just a true statement offered simply. Call Adele, she said. I'm going home. Home, she thought, walking to the car. She had said home. She had meant Reeve Tower. She was not sure when that had happened. The cooperation agreement was filed with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts on the 4th of December, 6 days after the Oyster Bar meeting. Adele Marsh delivered the physical evidentiary package in person, and Callum attended the meeting with the Assistant U.S. Attorney with the specific quality of a man who had been carrying a very large thing for 3 years and was finally setting it down in the right place. Mara watched him come home that evening. She had started thinking of 6 o'clock as home time, without quite deciding to. And she could see the difference in how he was carrying himself. Not lighter, not exactly more present, more fully occupying the space of himself. How did it go? She asked. The AUSA said it was one of the most comprehensive voluntary cooperation packages she had received in 15 years. He looked tired, and underneath the tiredness, something that was on the way to relief. She said they expect to file charges against Bernard within 90 days. Mara was quiet for a moment. She thought about her father's reports filed over the course of a year, each one routed carefully and buried. She thought about the handwritten annotation managed, "This do not escalate." She thought about 3 dock workers' families and their NDAs and the long silence they'd been living in. My father would have wanted to know it was used, she said. It was used, Callum said. His work was the foundation of the case. Adele made that clear in the submission. She nodded. She was not going to cry about this in front of him. She would do that later privately in the way she handled the things that were too large for public space. But she felt it the specific grief of a completed thing, the way a case resolved in the archive often felt not triumphant, but finished. The damage acknowledged, the record corrected. Thank you, she said. He shook his head slightly. Don't. I'm thanking you, she said. You cannot want thanks all you want, but I'm offering it. Something moved in his face. He sat down in the chair across from her drafting table, not at the edge this time, all the way into it, the way he sat when he was being personal rather than strategic. I need to tell you something else, he said. She looked at him. Bernard moved before the filing, he said. When he understood the cooperation agreement was going forward, he tried one more option. He contacted the 3 workers' families, reached out to the settlement attorneys, and attempted to renegotiate the NDAs to add a new provision that would have blocked them from speaking to federal investigators. His voice was even. Adele was watching for it. We had it intercepted within 24 hours. It became part of the filing additional evidence of active obstruction. He walked into the trap, Mara said. He walked into the trap. A pause. He's been placed on administrative leave from Reeve Maritime as of this morning. His access to company systems has been revoked. Callum looked at his hands for a moment. I'm the sole active executive now, alone technically for the first time. How does that feel? He thought about this honestly. Like I have the company I inherited and not the company I've been managing around. Like I can actually see what it is. A pause. It feels necessary. Like something that was blocking the light has been moved. Mara thought about blocked light. She thought about documents that had been stored in the wrong conditions, too dark, too damp. The damage compounding quietly for years until someone finally brought them into proper storage, and the true extent of the deterioration became visible, which was always the necessary precondition for beginning the repair. What do you do now? She asked. Now I finish the transition to legitimate operations. The timeline I had was 18 months. I'm compressing it. Adele and the AUSA have agreed to a structure where Reeve Maritime's cooperation in the prosecution of Bernard constitutes partial satisfaction of civil liability, which means the company survives the case rather than being dismantled by it. He looked at her. I want to offer the workers' families direct acknowledgement, not through a legal settlement structure, something more honest. A formal acknowledgement of causation, the suppressed reports entered into the public record, and an offer to release them from the NDAs entirely.
They may still sue, Mara said.
I know. He held her gaze. That's appropriate. She looked at him. She looked at this man who had inherited a criminal empire and spent 3 years building a case against his own family and was now sitting across from her, 7.5 months pregnant with his child, talking about what was appropriate, as if the whole structure of the last 8 months had been organized around earning the right to use that word in his own voice. Callum, she said. He looked at her. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need to say it before the baby comes while I still have approximately 17 seconds of emotional bandwidth left on any given day. He waited. I'm in love with you, she said. I have been for a while. I kept waiting until the situation was resolved enough to say it honestly without it sounding like gratitude or circumstance. But I think this is resolved enough. She held his gaze. I love you. Not Cal Reed, not the man in the note you. The person who called Adele at midnight and refused the settlement and learned to read prenatal care research and told me the truth about my father when you didn't have to. A pause. That person. The room was very quiet. I love you too, he said. He said it without preparation, without the careful architecture he usually built around important things. I have since the first time you told me that chart was altered and looked at me like the answer was obvious and I should catch up. A pause. I've been trying to earn the right to say it. You've earned it, she said. He stood and came around the drafting table, and she stood to meet him, and he kissed her with the specific quality of a man who has been managing his restraint for a very long time and has just been given permission to stop, and she kissed him back with the specific quality of a woman who knows her own mind and has finally decided it's pointing in the right direction. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers and kept his hands on either side of her face with the careful tenderness he always used when he touched her, as if she was the most irreplaceable thing in the room. We still have to figure out everything, she said against his mouth. I know. This doesn't resolve the complexity. No. He pulled back slightly enough to look at her, but it makes it significantly better. She almost laughed. That's an understatement. I've been working on understatement, he said. I thought it would be a useful skill. This time she did laugh. And outside the harbor held its lights in the December dark, and somewhere in Marblehead, a 38-foot sloop named the Patience sat in her slip, and there were still many complicated things between them and the future, the trial, the company transition, the delivery. That was 6 weeks away, the question of what their life together actually looked like past the crisis. But inside the penthouse above the harbor, Mara Voss and Callum Reeve were learning to occupy the same space without the armor of necessity, and it was improbably and completely enough. The 6 weeks between the cooperation agreement filing and Mara's due date moved with the specific compression of time that comes at the end of a pregnancy days, measured in the small increments of change, rather than hours each one slightly heavier than the last. December settled over Boston in the way it did in harbor cities. Not the decorative snow of the television version, but the low gray cold that came off the water and made everything feel older, more specific, more like what it actually was. Mara worked at her drafting table through most of it, nominally on a commission she had accepted in October, an 18th century navigational atlas in poor condition, several folios requiring stabilization before they could be imaged, but increasingly in the company of documents that were not strictly professional. She had requested the full case file from Adele. She was reading her father's reports in their entirety. It was different reading them now than it had been reading fragments in Callum's conference room. Now she read them with the full context assembled around them, the routing records, the flagging notations, the chain of suppression, the eventual collapse, and the 3 deaths, and the NDAs and the years of silence. She read them, and she could see her father in the writing, his careful precision, his refusal to speculate beyond what the data supported, his understanding that a report was only useful if it could not be dismissed, which meant it had to be irrefutable. He had known exactly what he was doing. He had built something that was supposed to survive him. It had survived him. It had taken longer than it should have, and the path was not the one he'd built, but the thing he'd built had held. She told Callum about this one evening in the 3rd week of December at the corner of the table where the harbor light came through. She didn't plan to. It came out in the middle of a conversation about something else the way things did when you'd been carrying them, and the carrying became too practiced, too automatic, and you let go without quite deciding to. He knew what he was doing, she said. He built it so it couldn't be ignored. He just didn't know how long it would take. Callum was quiet for a moment. I keep thinking about the gap, he said. 3 years between when I found the annotation and when it was filed. If I had moved faster. Don't, she said. It's a case. Cases take time. You needed the full record or it wouldn't have held. I keep thinking about those 3 years for the workers' families. So do I. She met his eyes. And I'm going to think about it for a long time, probably. But Callum, you can't carry that indefinitely. You found the damage. You stabilized it. You brought it to the right place. That's the whole job. A pause. The rest of it belongs to the court. He looked at her with the expression that had become over 6 weeks the expression she associated with him when he let himself stop managing. You're very good at this. At what? At knowing which things to carry and which to set down. Most people don't know the difference. It's professional training, she said. You can't do good conservation work if you're attached to the damage. You have to care about the document, not the damage. The damage is just what you work through to get to the thing worth preserving. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him thinking about this filing, applying it to something. Is that how you think about me? He asked. The damage is just what you work through. The damage is part of you, she said. I'm not working through you to get to something simpler. I'm working with the whole thing. She held his gaze, the damage included. He reached across the table and took her hand in the way he did sometimes now, simply without ceremony, as if he'd been doing it for years and it was not yet that, but was becoming something like that. I'm going to be a good father, he said. It wasn't a promise to her. It was a statement to himself with her as witness. I know, she said. You've been doing the work. He had. She had watched him do it the prenatal class he'd attended with her in the second week of December, sitting in a circle of couples, and being for once in his life simply a person without the weight of his name, learning the same things everyone else was learning and asking questions that were better than the average of the room. The nursery, which he had continued working on, even after she'd told him it looked finished, adding small things, a particularly good lamp for the rocking chair, a particular rug he'd found in an estate sale that was, he said, unimpeachably soft. The Spanish lullabies he had been practicing with the careful embarrassment of a man who was very good at most things, he applied himself to and was not good at this but was doing it anyway. You're going to have to teach me more, he said one evening when she'd caught him consulting a handwritten list of lyrics she recognized as her own phonetic transcriptions. I have been teaching you, she said. You're getting better. I'm getting less alarming, he said. That's different, she laughed. The baby moved and she put Callum's hand on the specific spot, and they sat there in the kitchen with the December harbor outside, and his hand on her stomach, and the particular quality of a moment that was not trying to be anything except what it was. She thought, this is what it looks like. Not perfect, not simple, not without the weight of everything it was built through, but real and present and worth the complexity. She thought my father would have liked him. Once he understood who he was actually dealing with. She thought we are going to be all right. 3 days before Christmas, the U.S. Attorney's Office announced formally that charges had been filed against Bernard Reeve on 22 counts, including wire fraud conspiracy to obstruct federal regulatory processes and accessory liability in connection with the deaths of 3 workers at the Pier 14 facility. The Reeve Maritime Services settlement, Callum's cooperation structure, was announced simultaneously, along with the public release of Daniel Voss's suppressed reports, and a statement from Callum personally acknowledging the failures of his company's compliance infrastructure. It made the evening news. Mara watched it on her laptop at the drafting table with a cup of tea, going cold beside her. And when the anchor cut to the footage of Callum delivering the statement outside Reeve Tower in the December cold, in the particular controlled stillness that was just his, she felt something settle in her chest with the weight of a thing that was finally where it belonged. Her phone rang. Her mother. I'm watching the news, Elena said. I know. They're saying Daniel Voss's reports are now part of the public record. They are. A long pause. He'd have been very quiet about it, Elena said. He was always very quiet when something he'd built actually worked. He didn't want to make too much of it. I know, Mara said. Her voice was careful. He would have been proud of you, Elena said. Not for this specifically.
for the whole thing, for how you handled it.
Mara pressed her free hand flat on the surface of the drafting table and felt the cool wood under her palm and said, "I know, Mama." After she hung up, she sat in the quiet of the penthouse with the December harbor outside, and the baby moving in the large present way she had lately, no longer flutters but definite shifts, the insistent weight of a person who was very nearly ready to arrive in the world she was being prepared for. And Callum came home at 6 o'clock, which was when Callum came home now, and when he walked into the sitting room and saw her face, he crossed the room and sat beside her and put his arm around her without asking anything, which was exactly what she needed, and they sat together in the December dark, and the harbor lights came on one by one in the channel below, and Mara thought this is what it looks like when something damaged gets repaired properly. Not new, not unmarked, but intact, functional, itself, ready for what comes next. Christmas was quiet. They had not planned this, had not discussed what Christmas would be, whether it would be a celebration or a formality or simply a day on the calendar. But Elena came for dinner on the 24th, driven from St. Anne's in the Reeve family car, with her cane and her good winter coat, and Callum cooked pasta, which was the only thing he reliably cooked well, while Mara sat at the kitchen island and directed, and her mother sat at the table and issued critiques that had the particular quality of enjoying themselves.
"You're using too much salt," Elena said.
"This is the correct amount of salt," Callum said. "She can't have too much salt. She's 34 weeks. "I can have normal amounts of salt," Mara said. "I'm not a medical condition." "You're a medical condition. You're a late-term pregnancy. There is a category conditions." Callum caught Mara's eye from across the kitchen, and she could see him working very hard not to smile. She looked away before she started laughing and gave her mother the satisfaction. After dinner, Elena sat with Callum in the sitting room while Mara, who had reached the gestational phase where 15 minutes on her feet translated directly to 40 minutes of lower back negotiations, rested on the sofa and listened to her mother and this man she loved talk to each other with the particular quality of two people who had agreed on something important and were working out the details.
"She's going to need help," Elena said. She was talking about after the birth, about the early weeks.
"She won't ask for it. She's been managing without help for so long she doesn't know how to ask anymore." "I know," Callum said. "You have to notice. You can't wait for her to say something." "I've noticed that about her." A pause. "It's one of the things I find most—" He stopped.
"Admirable," Elena said.
"Terrifying," he said, "because she'll exhaust herself before she admits she needs anything."
"Yes."
Mara could hear the approval in her mother's voice, the grudging, real kind, not the performed kind. "You understand her." "I'm learning her," Callum said. "There's still a lot to learn. There always will be." A pause. "That's the point." Mara lay on the sofa and listened to this conversation happening on her behalf and felt the weight of something she didn't have a complete word for. Not contentment, exactly, not happiness exactly, but the specific quality of having arrived somewhere real, of being for the first time in a very long time exactly where she was supposed to be. The baby kicked once, hard as if in agreement. "I can hear you thinking from here," Callum said. She turned her head. He was in the doorway between the sitting room and the sofa corner, her mother visible behind him, having apparently engineered this exit from the room with the particular efficiency of a woman who had decided something and was acting on it.
"I think loudly," Mara said. "I know." He came and sat on the edge of the sofa near her feet. "Your mother's trying to give us a moment. She's not subtle about it."
"She's never been subtle about anything in her life. It's a Voss characteristic." He looked at her in the Christmas quiet of the penthouse, with the harbor lights outside, and her mother visible through the doorway, examining the bookshelves with academic interest. And his face had the quality it had when he let himself be fully present, rather than managing the presentation of being present. And she thought, this is who he is. This is the person underneath all the other things. This man who makes pasta and practices lullabies and sat in a car on Congress Street for an hour, listening to his uncle try to buy off his child's mother, and is now sitting at the edge of a sofa telling me my mother isn't subtle. "I want to ask you something," he said.
"Okay."
"Not now, not this second, I mean at some point. I want to ask you something about the future." His voice was careful and honest, the way it always was when something mattered. "I'm not asking yet because I don't want the timing to feel like it's about the baby or the legal situation or anything circumstantial. I want to ask when it's just about us." Mara looked at him. She understood what he was talking about,
and she felt the weight of it, and she thought about timing and circumstance and the question of what things were free of context versus what things simply were.
Ask when you're ready, she said. I'll answer the same either way. Something in his face went completely quiet. A different quality of stillness from his usual control. The kind that comes when something has been hoped for and received, and the receiving is almost too much to organize. Okay, he said. Her mother from the other room said, Callum, what edition is this, Morrison? I think this is a first edition. It is, he called back. My grandfather's copy.
Elena, don't open it, Mara said. She'll open it. I'm already opening it, Elena said, in a tone that made it clear the Voss character applied across generations.
Callum stood and laughed and went back to preserve the first edition Samuel Eliot Morrison from Elena Voss. And Mara lay on the sofa and listened to her mother and the man she loved argue cheerfully about maritime history in the next room, and the harbor held its lights in the December dark. And somewhere in the city, 3 dock workers' families were perhaps sitting with their own Christmases and their NDAs, and the knowledge that the record had finally been corrected, and somewhere in the federal court system, the machinery of accountability was assembling itself around the evidence her father had built. And 6 weeks from now, her daughter was going to arrive in a world that was not simple and not without damage, but was being worked on carefully by people who understood that repair was the whole job. Mara pressed her hand against her stomach and felt her daughter move. She thought, we're almost there. The baby came in January. Not on the due date. No baby has ever been considerate enough to arrive on schedule. But 3 days early, on a Tuesday morning, when the harbor was frozen at the edges and the sky above Boston had gone the particular flat white that preceded a real storm. Mara had been awake since 2 with the particular low, insistent pressure she had been told to expect, and had spent 4 hours alternately reading walking circuits of the penthouse and declining to wake Callum because she was still assessing whether what she was experiencing was the beginning of something or the Braxton Hicks that Dr. Huang had warned could be deceptive in the final weeks. At 6 in the morning, she woke him. He was in the hallway outside her room before she'd finished saying his name. How long, he said. Not a question, a demand for specific information, and she appreciated that he didn't perform concern at her instead of gathering data. Since about 2, they're 8 minutes apart now. He was already moving. She could see the training assert itself, the particular efficiency of a man who had spent his professional life making decisions under pressure and had applied that capacity to a very different set of circumstances. He called Dr. Huang. He described the contraction interval and duration with the precision of someone who had been timing them mentally since the moment he understood what was happening. He helped her change without making it feel like assistance, which required a specific calibration she noticed and filed. He had the bag packed since week 36, reviewed twice in the car before she'd finished her shoes. The drive to Mercy General was 22 minutes through the early morning of a Tuesday. Boston was not yet fully awakened. Marcus drove. Callum sat beside her in the back and did not tell her to breathe, did not tell her it was going to be fine, did not perform reassurance. He held her hand and said at one point, 8 minutes is still generous time. That's not comforting, she said. I wasn't trying to comfort you, I was providing information. That's somehow worse.
Do you want me to lie to you?
She considered this through a contraction. No. Then 8 minutes is generous time. She laughed briefly and with effort, and he watched her do it with the expression he got when something surprised him in the best way, and the city moved past the tinted windows of the Range Rover, and the harbor was steel white in the January dawn, and Mara Voss thought, we are about to have a baby, and I am not afraid. Labor was long. 13 hours of it, which Dr. Huang called well within normal range, in the even tone she used when she was preventing panic through information delivery, and which felt from the inside like a significantly less manageable length of time. Mara did not spend those 13 hours being stoic. She was not, it turned out, a stoic person in extremis. She was a direct person, which was different, and what she did was ask for what she needed and say, when something was not working, and refuse the epidural for the first 6 hours before deciding that the research on labor pain was in fact less informative than the experience, and requesting it with the efficiency of someone updating their position based on new evidence. Callum was there for all of it, not in the performing presence way, not in the way of someone fulfilling an obligation or demonstrating commitment. In the genuinely their way, the way that required a person to set down everything else and be in the room with full attention. He had cleared his schedule entirely. He had silenced his phone. He sat in the chair beside the bed, and held the hand she offered him and did not make it about himself. When she needed him to talk, he talked. When she needed him to stop talking, he stopped. When she needed him to leave for a half hour so she could have the room to herself, and Dr. Huang he left without hesitation and returned when she called. At hour 11, she looked at him from the bed. Both of them passed the point of presenting themselves to each other, both reduced to the unmanaged versions that extremity produces, and said, "I want you to know that I've thought about this a lot. Who you are. Whether what you've shown me is real." He looked at her. He was very still.
"It's real," she said. "I'm saying it now because I'm not sure I'll want to have this conversation when it's over. I'm saying it now while I still have enough cognitive function to mean it properly." She held his gaze. "You're a good man. You're not a simple man, and you're not without your damage, and you're going to make mistakes, but the core of you is good, and I want you to know I can see it."
He didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was stripped of everything except what was true. "You have changed what is possible for me," he said. "I want you to know that." She nodded. Another contraction crested, and she gripped his hand and breathed through it. And they said nothing else about this because it had been said and received, and that was enough. At 7:14 in the evening, their daughter arrived. She was 8 pounds 1 ounce, and she came into the world with the same directness that Mara would later say turn out to be characteristic: a short absolute cry, and then an apparent assessment of the situation, and then a settling into the arms placed under her with the air of a person who had decided she was willing to see how this went. Dr. Huang placed her on Mara's chest, and Mara felt the weight of her, the specific, undeniable weight of a person who had been a presence for 9 months, and was now definitively real, and held her with both hands, and felt something so large it didn't have language, only the physical fact of her warm and present, and entirely herself. Callum's hand was on Mara's shoulder. She could feel him shaking very slightly.
"Come here," she said. He bent down and she turned so he could see his daughter's face, and she watched Callum Reeve, who was many things, who had been many things, who was becoming carefully and with effort the thing he most needed to be. She watched him look at his daughter for the first time and lose every piece of management he had ever built in his life all at once, completely without a trace. He put a single finger against the baby's palm. She gripped it. "Hello," he said. It was not much. It was everything. Mara watched him and thought, there it is. Whatever we were before we are this now. We are the people who made her, and she is the argument for all of it.
They had not settled on a name exactly. They had a short list and had been unable to commit, which Mara privately thought was because the decision felt too final until she was real. But when Callum looked up from his daughter's face, which he did slowly, and with the expression of a man returning from somewhere he hadn't expected to go, he said, "Nora." She looked at him. "Your grandmother, she was the most honest person I ever knew," he said, and she had no patience for excuses. Mara looked at her daughter. She thought about a woman she had never met and the inscription in the Hemingway she'd read by accident for my son, who will always choose the hard right over the easy wrong. "Nora," she said. The baby made a small sound, not quite approval, but something in that direction. "Nora, see?" Mara confirmed. They went home 3 days later on a Friday afternoon when the January storm had passed, and Boston was sharp and clear, in the cold, the harbor brilliant with reflected winter light. The 41st floor suite was different. Had been different since the nursery was finished, since the house had rearranged itself around the expectation of a new person, but it was more different now because the expectation had resolved into presence, and presence changed everything. Mara's mother was waiting. Elena had insisted on being there, and Callum had arranged her transport with the efficiency she was learning to accept as his particular love language. And when Mara walked through the door with Nora bundled against her chest, she found her mother in the sitting room with tears already moving down her face, which Elena managed with her characteristic efficiency, acknowledging them, not performing them, moving directly to the business of holding her granddaughter. The business of holding her granddaughter took most of the afternoon. Callum watched this from a careful distance, not excluded but giving them the shape of it, understanding that this moment belonged to the Voss women in a specific way that he could witness but not enter. He brought tea nobody drank. He sat in the kitchen and read the same 3 pages of a book repeatedly. At one point, Marcus knocked at the door with flowers from the building staff which none of them had requested, and Callum accepted them with an expression that suggested he was moved by this in a way he found mildly embarrassing. Mara watched all of this from the sofa and thought about the word family and what it contained and how much of it you couldn't plan for. Later, after Elena had been driven back to St. Anne's and Nora was in her bassinet, doing the determined sleeping of new people, Mara stood at the window of the suite and looked at the harbor in the January dark and waited for Callum to come stand beside her, which he did because he had learned her rhythms the way she'd learned his. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking about the word home," she said. "I moved in here 6 weeks ago under circumstances, and now I'm thinking of it as home. I'm trying to understand when that happened. When you told me about your father's reports at the drafting table," he said, "that's when you stopped treating it as temporary." She turned to look at him. "How do you know that?" "Because that's when you started sitting at the table instead of standing next to it," he said. "People stand when they're ready to leave a room." She stared at him. "You notice that?" "I notice you." He said it simply as if it were obvious. "I've been noticing you for a year." She thought about 8 months of being invisible in this building, and one October afternoon in front of an open flat file and a note that had said, "You are remarkable, Mara. I'll find you again." She thought about the distance between that and here, this January window, this January dark, this man standing beside her who had found her again in the way that mattered. "I have something to ask you," he said. She turned fully to face him. He put his hand in his jacket pocket. He brought out a ring, plain and specific, a thin band with a single stone, a sapphire, the particular gray-blue of harbor water in winter, which she recognized immediately as a choice, and not an accident. "This is the question I said I'd wait for the right time to ask," he said. "I've decided this is the right time, not because of Nora, not because of the case, because of you. Because of the specific person you are and what it costs you to trust anyone, and the fact that you trusted me anyway, and because I want to be the person you keep trusting for the rest of our lives." He held her gaze. "Will you marry me?" Outside the harbor was very dark and very wide, and the navigation lights moved in their ancient patterns through the channel, and the city spread in all directions from this point above the water. And Mara thought about a conservation project, the way the goal was never to make something look new, only to make it intact, functional, honest about what it had been through. She thought about her father. She thought about 3 dock workers' families and a suppressed report and a federal case that was proceeding through its proper channels. She thought about a 38-foot sloop named the Patience in a slip in Marblehead, and a man who hadn't sailed in 4 years because he'd been managing an inherited wrong and who was now finally facing the water again. She thought this is what repair looks like. Not unmarked, not simple, but real in ours. "Yes," she said. Obviously, yes." He put the ring on her finger with hands that were completely steady. He had practiced this, she realized, or maybe he hadn't needed to. Maybe after everything he had faced, this was simply what his hands did when the outcome had already been decided by the person he was. She kissed him. He kissed her back. In the bassinet across the room, Nora made a sound that could have been commentary or could have been digestion, and they both turned to look at her because this was already their reflex, the looking toward her. First, the rest of the world, second, and then they looked back at each other and laughed. Which was, Mara thought, exactly the right register for this particular moment. "We should tell her," Callum said. "She's 9 days old. She should still know." Mara looked at him. She looked at this man who was improbably and completely hers. She thought, yes, he should absolutely tell her. She should know from the very beginning that this is what people do. They make commitments and they keep them carefully daily with attention and repair and the willingness to stay in the room with damaged things until they understand what they're working with. "Tell her," Mara said. He went to the bassinet. He leaned down over his daughter with the tenderness he had been developing for 9 months and which had arrived fully formed the moment she had gripped his finger. He said very quietly, "Your mother just said yes. I wanted you to know." Nora's expression, insofar as 9-day-old people had, expressions could generously be described as considering the matter. Mara stood at the harbor window and watched this and thought we are all 3 of us exactly where we are supposed to be.
Nah.
The trial began in March. Bernard Reeve's defense team had spent the intervening months doing what defense teams do when the evidentiary case is solid and the political exposure is significant. They moved for postponement 3 times, filed motions to suppress that were denied twice, and made several attempts to argue that the cooperation agreement between Reeve Maritime and the U.S. Attorney's Office constituted a conflict of interest that tainted the entire case. The presiding judge, a woman in her 60s who had been watching federal prosecutors and defense attorneys perform these particular maneuvers for 30 years, was unimpressed by all of it.
Mara followed the proceedings from the drafting table while Nora slept in the bassinet beside her.
She was not a party to the case. Her father's reports were evidentiary, entered into the record through the cooperation agreement, but Mara herself was not called to testify. She had, in Adele's assessment, the cleanest possible relationship to the evidence. She had identified the suppression mechanism, she had facilitated the wire meeting with Bernard, and she had stepped back and let the machinery of the court do the rest. Her father had taught her how to file a report. He had not needed to teach her how to stay out of the way when the people who were supposed to act on it finally did. Callum testified. She watched the footage that evening. The cameras were not in the courtroom, but the press pool outside the federal building had filmed his arrival, and several reporters had noted the quality of his manner measured direct the controlled precision of a man who had spent years carrying information that needed to be delivered accurately. He wore a dark suit and no tie. He walked in without Marcus, which she knew he'd decided was a statement. When he came home, she was at the table with Nora awake in her arms, and the footage paused on her laptop.
"How was it?" she asked.
"Like removing something that had been embedded too long," he said. "Painful at the moment of removal and immediately better after." She looked at him. He looked tired in the way that went deeper than the surface, the tired of someone who has done a thing that needed doing and has paid the actual cost of it, rather than the managed version. He sat across from her and looked at Nora with the expression that had become her favorite of his wholly unguarded, the face he only showed to the two of them, and lately to Elena. "He looked at me like I was the one who did this to him," Callum said.
"You did do this to him," Mara said.
"He suppressed safety reports that got 3 people killed, and you built a case against him for it. That's not betrayal. That's accountability." "I know." He reached out, and Nora, who had been in the 2-week process of learning to focus her eyes, fixed her gaze on him with the absolute concentration of a new person encountering something interesting. "She's watching me," he said. "She's been watching you specifically for 3 days. I think she's already decided you're her primary entertainment. That's a small audience."
"It's the right audience."
Mara watched him with Nora. She thought, this is it. This is what changes a person. Not the crisis, not the case, not the choice between the easy wrong and the hard right. It's this. The small face learning what a face is. The specific weight of a person who trusts you completely because they have no frame of reference for doing otherwise.
"I want to take you somewhere," Callum said, still watching Nora. "When she's old enough, before summer."
"Where?"
"Marblehead. The boat."
He looked up. "I want to take you sailing, properly. I've been practicing." "You've been practicing sailing twice a week since November." He said it with the slight embarrassment of a man who has applied himself methodically to something he's committed to. "I told you I was going to learn to do it properly before I took anyone anywhere." She looked at him. She thought about a late-night text in November, anywhere you wanted. She thought about a man who made promises in small places and kept them with the same attention he kept the large ones. "Yes," she said, "before summer." The verdict came on the 14th of April, which was the 43rd day of the trial, and a Tuesday, which meant Mara was doing laundry when Adele called. She answered with one hand while managing the laundry basket with the other, which was the reality of new parenthood, regardless of the floor you lived on or who your fiancé was.
"Guilty on 17 of 22 counts," Adele said without preamble. "Wire fraud obstruction, 3 counts of conspiracy.
Sentencing in 60 days. D." Mara set down the laundry basket. "The workers' families have been notified," Adele continued. "The NDA releases were processed last week. They're free to speak. The Globe has already called 3 of them. There will be a story."
"Good," Mara said. "The Reeve Maritime Settlement holds. The company survives." A pause.
Callum should know that the AUSA personally noted the quality of the cooperation. "That's not nothing." "I know," Mara said. "Thank you, Adele." She ended the call and stood in the kitchen of the penthouse with the laundry basket at her feet and looked out at the April harbor, which was doing its April thing, clearing slowly the ice, at the channel edges retreating, the light coming back warmer and more present with every week. Her daughter was asleep in the nursery. Her mother was coming for Sunday dinner. The man she was going to marry was in a meeting downtown that was about shipping insurance rather than anything else, and he would be home by 6, and she would tell him then. She picked up the laundry basket. She finished the laundry. She made a cup of tea and sat at the drafting table and opened the atlas she was working on. The 18th century navigational folios, the commission from October, which she had been doing slowly and well in the available hours. And she looked at the old paper in the good afternoon light and thought about what her father had said to her once when she was in school and had asked him why he kept filing reports that no one seemed to read. Because the record matters, he had said. You put it in the record and someone someday will read it. That's why the record exists. She thought someone read it, Dad. We made sure. She thought you built this and we finished it. She thought about the portal and chart in the climate-controlled case on the east wall of Callum's private study, the one she'd been meaning to examine properly since October. She had been in and out of that study 100 times in the past 4 months, but always as a person who lived in this building, now a person with other priorities, a person who kept being interrupted by more important things, and she had never stopped in front of that case. That evening, after Nora's 7 o'clock feeding and before Callum came home, she stood in front of the case and looked at the portal and chart properly for the first time. It was as she had suspected from October late 15th century Genoese. The parchment was in remarkable condition, stored well, not exposed with none of the foxing she would expect from something this age that hadn't been cared for. The coastline of the western Mediterranean, the Atlantic coast down to the Azores, the characteristic thumb lines radiating from their compass roses with the precision that still after 20 years of looking at these made her catch her breath. And in the lower left corner, in the small space, traditionally left for the cartographer's mark, she found something she had not expected, a notation in a hand she recognized. Not the cartographer's hand, a later edition careful and deliberate in the particular ink on vellum script that she associated with early 18th century restoration annotations. Her father's name. Not her father, a different Voss. An ancestor, possibly, or a coincidence of the most remarkable kind, though she did not much believe in remarkable coincidences. A Voss who had at some point in the early 18th century annotated this chart in the corner with the conservator's traditional mark examined, stabilized, returned to circulation. She stood in front of the case for a very long time. When Callum came home, she was still there, and he came to stand beside her without asking why, because he had learned by now to come stand beside her first and ask questions second. And she pointed to the annotation and said, "Look at that." He looked. He went still. "That's my name," she said, "or my family's name. 300 years ago, someone in my family handled this chart. And now you're here," he said quietly. "And now I'm here." She looked at the chart, its coasts and its compass roses, and its record of a world being navigated, being mapped, being made legible through attention and precision. "I wonder sometimes if my father would have found this strange or obvious, that it all connects." "What do you think?" "I think he would have said that's what the record is for," Mara said. "You put things in the record so that someone someday can read them." She turned to look at Callum. "And it all connects eventually, if enough people do their job." He looked at her in the late afternoon light of the private study with the harbor behind them and the April evening coming on and the sound of their daughter asleep in the next room of the building that was beyond any reasonable expectation their home. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the conference room on the first morning, like she was the most important thing in the room, but without the management now, without the careful presentation, just the fact of it. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you too." She turned back to the chart. "Have you had this properly examined?" "It needs documentation, the annotation in the corner particularly." "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. "I've been waiting for the right conservator." She looked at him. "I believe," she said, "that I'm available." Bernard Reeve was sentenced in June. 9 years in federal prison, $300,000 in fines, permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any maritime-related business. The sentencing judge in her remarks referenced Daniel Voss's report, specifically noted their quality, their precision, the clarity of the causation they established. The Boston Globe ran the story on the front page of the Metro section with a photograph of the 3 workers who had died in the Pier 14 collapse and a quote from one family member that Mara read 3 times before she could continue past it. "We just wanted someone to say it was preventable. We just wanted someone to say his death mattered." She called her mother after reading it. "I saw," Elena said. "Are you all right?" "I've been all right for a while." A pause. "I'm better than all right. I'm satisfied." Elena's voice had the particular quality Mara associated with her mother having arrived at something she'd been working toward. Your father was satisfied when he filed a correct report, not happy satisfied, like something was in its right place. Another pause. "That's what I feel." Mara stayed on the phone for an hour. She talked about the verdict about Nora's recent discovery that her own hands were interesting and could be put in her mouth about the wedding she and Callum were planning in a small and practical way about the chart in the study and the annotation and the strange specific way history folded back on itself if you watched long enough.
Bring Nora on Sunday, Elena said when they were wrapping up. I want to read to her. She's 3 months old. She can't understand reading.
I know. I'm doing it for myself. A pause. Tell Callum the pasta was good at Christmas. Better than I expected.
Tell him yourself on Sunday.
I will, Elena said. I just wanted you to know I noticed. After the call, Mara sat at the drafting table with the Portolan chart's preliminary documentation open in front of her. She had been working on it in the mornings, the methodical first-pass analysis that preceded restoration and thought about satisfaction, about the specific feeling of a thing in its right place. Callum came home at 6:15, slightly later than usual, and the first thing he did was go to the nursery, which was the first thing he always did now because Nora was always going to be the first thing, and Mara heard him in there talking to her in the low voice he used describing his day. Apparently, which he had started doing when Nora was 3 weeks old, on the theory that the particular frequency of his voice was what she was tracking, not the content, and which Mara thought might be one of the most purely Callum things he had ever done.
She went to the nursery doorway and leaned against the frame. Adele called, she said. Sentencing summary is filed. It's done.
He looked up from Nora. Something in his face settled into the specific expression she had learned to recognize as relief that had been waiting a very long time. Done.
Done.
He looked back down at Nora, who was looking up at him with the focused attention of a person conducting an ongoing investigation into the nature of her father's face. Your grandfather's case is closed, he told her seriously. The record is correct. The people responsible were held accountable. He paused. Your great-grandmother is coming Sunday, and she's going to read to you and tell you about him. He was a very good man. Nora's expression remained scientifically neutral. She's processing it, Mara said. I know. Callum lifted her carefully. He had gotten very good at this, the specific mechanics of picking up a small person who was both sturdy and catastrophically fragile feeling, and held her against his shoulder. I have something for you, he said. This was addressed to Mara.
What?
He nodded toward the sitting room. She followed him. On the coffee table, a manila envelope thicker than a business communication. She looked at him. The U.S. Attorney's Office has closed the evidentiary file, he said. The original documents go into federal archives, but they made copies of everything for the record. He paused. Adele asked them specifically to include the 3 reports in full. She said the family of the person who filed them should have copies.
Mara looked at the envelope. She picked it up. She held it. Open it when you want, Callum said. Or not tonight. Or not for a while. They're yours.
She held the envelope with both hands and felt the weight of it. The actual physical weight of 3 reports filed over a year by a man who had known what he was doing and had done it anyway. She thought about what it would feel like to open this to see her father's name on the headers, to read his words in his careful, particular handwriting, and know that those words were now part of the permanent federal record, correctly filed, correctly attributed, in their right place. Not tonight, she said. Soon. He nodded. He held Nora and watched her and said nothing else about it, which was exactly the right thing. Later. After Nora was down and the city outside was settling into its summer evening, they sat together at the harbor window, the same window they had stood at in November, in the early days when everything was still crisis and management and careful architecture, and it was a different window now, in the way that windows become different when what you see through them has changed. The harbor was vivid in the June evening. The lights were coming on in the channel, the same ancient language, red and green and white, marking the same ancient intentions, who you were, where you were going, which side you were asking to pass on. When we get married, Mara said, I want it to be on the boat. Callum looked at her. The patience, she said. Whatever we do, I want to be on the water. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him thinking about this, running the logistics, assessing the weather and the season and the safety protocols for a ceremony on a 38-foot sloop with a 3-month-old in attendance, and then setting all of that aside. Yes, he said. You'll have to actually be able to sail it by then. I've been sailing twice a week since November, he said. I'm adequate. Adequate isn't the same as good. No, he agreed. But it's better than tolerated. She looked at him. She thought about a man and his grandfather's boat,
and 4 years of not going and 2 months of going twice a week, and the particular kind of effort that looks like nothing from the outside because it's just showing up and doing the work. "You'll be good by August," she said. "That's an optimistic assessment." "I'm a documents conservator," she said. "I've spent 20 years making optimistic assessments about damaged things and then doing the work to prove them right." He looked at her, and she looked at him. And outside the harbor held its lights and its language and its long patient history, and inside the penthouse above the water, their daughter was asleep in her first spring, and the portolan chart was waiting in its case, and the envelope with her father's reports was on the coffee table in its right place, and Mara Voss thought all of this together is what a life looks like when it's been properly repaired. She thought we did the work. She thought this is what comes after.
Chico,
In July, Mara opened her father's reports. She did it alone at the drafting table in the early morning, before Nora woke with a cup of tea and the particular July light coming off the harbor in long, flat lines. She opened the envelope carefully. She was a conservator. She was always careful with documents, and spread the 3 reports on the table and read them from beginning to end without stopping. They were exactly what she had expected, precise, specific, utterly clear. Her father's voice was in every paragraph, the refusal to speculate, the careful notation of observable fact, the measurements and load calculations and structural assessments that built to an undeniable conclusion. He had not been angry in these reports. He had been professional, which in retrospect was the most devastating thing about them. He had been completely professional and completely correct, and someone had buried him anyway. She read the 3rd report's final page twice. Her father had added a note in his own handwriting, not part of the formal assessment. A marginal annotation that said, "These findings require immediate remediation. Delay constitutes unacceptable risk to workers." She sat with this for a while. Then she took her phone and took a photograph of the annotation and sent it to her mother with no caption. Her mother replied 3 minutes later, "That's him. That's exactly him." She folded the reports back into the envelope. She put them on the shelf of the flat file where she kept her most important documents between a commission she was particularly proud of and the navigational atlas that was nearly finished. She put them where they could be seen in good light, where she would look at them every day. She thought, "You built this, Dad. I just finished it." The tea was cold. She made more. The harbor did its July thing, bright and busy, and downstairs in the building the city was beginning to move. And in the nursery, her daughter was beginning to make the particular sounds that meant she was considering the question of whether to be awake, and somewhere in Marblehead, a 38-foot sloop named the Patience was waiting in her slip, and in 6 weeks, Mara Voss was going to marry Callum Reeve on the water in the August light, in the presence of her mother and 3 dock workers' families who had been invited because she had insisted, and Callum had agreed without hesitation, which was the answer she had needed to know about him. She sat at her drafting table and watched the harbor and waited for her daughter to wake up. She thought, this is what it looks like when the record is correct. She thought, we're here. They married in August on a Tuesday because Callum said Tuesdays were the day everything important happened to them. And Mara said that was the most superstitious thing she had ever heard from a man who ran a maritime holding company. And he said those were not mutually exclusive categories. And she said yes, because it was true. The day was clear. It was one of those August days on Boston Harbor that feel like a gift the city offers, reluctantly knowing it will have to take it back in November. The water very blue, the sky very wide, the light that particular quality of late summer in New England that has no analog anywhere else. The patient sat in her Marblehead slip with her teak deck oiled and her rigging dressed with flowers that Mara's mother had arranged, and which Elena maintained were not excessive, but which were objectively a great deal of flowers for a 38-foot vessel. The guests were few. Elena in her good coat already crying before anyone had said anything significant. Adele Marsh, who stood at the stern with a glass of sparkling water and the expression of a woman who had not expected to be moved by proceedings and was mildly annoyed to find herself wrong. Dr. Huang, who had made a note in her calendar that she was attending a wedding on a boat and had brought appropriate shoes, which was the most proactively sensible thing Mara had ever observed anyone do. Marcus, who was in his best suit and appeared to be managing a significant amount of feeling with the practiced compression of a man who had exactly the right relationship to his employer and had not expected it to expand. And the 3 families. The Marchetti family, 2 sons, a daughter, and a wife, who was 57 and had Daniel Marchetti's dark eyes.
The Reyes family, a mother and her adult children, 3 of them, who had driven from Dorchester. The Kim family, a father alone, who had taken the train from Salem and who stood at the bow of the Patience and looked at the harbor with the specific quality of someone who knew harbors and had lost someone to one and was still deciding how to be in that knowledge. Mara had written to them individually 6 months ago. She had not asked them to come to a trial or a press conference or anything that required them to perform their grief for institutional purposes. She had simply written in her own handwriting on paper and told them who she was, what her father had done, what the case had established, and that if they wanted to be present at the moment when the people who were responsible for the suppression were formally married to the family that was finishing Daniel Voss's work, they were welcome. No expectation, no obligation, just an invitation to witness something true. All 3 families had said yes. She had not told Callum until the responses came in. When she showed him the letters, he had been quiet for a long moment. Not the controlled quiet of management, but the absolute quiet of someone receiving something they hadn't known they needed. "This is the right thing," he said. "I know," she said. He had looked at her. "You are extraordinary," he said for the 3rd time in the year since he'd meant it consistently. It landed the same way each time. The ceremony was short. A justice of the peace, Adele had recommended a woman in her late 60s who conducted civil ceremonies with the efficient warmth of someone who understood that the important thing was not the ceremony, but the commitment, and that the ceremony's job was to mark the commitment in a way people would remember. Mara had not prepared remarks. She had thought about it, had sat at the drafting table several times in the previous weeks with the intention of writing something, and had decided each time that the things she wanted to say to Callum were not for a ceremony. They were for Tuesday mornings at 6 o'clock when Nora woke them both, and he got up without being asked. For the evening, she came out of the study to find him reading to Nora in the nursery. Not lullabies now, but maps holding her up to see the Portolan chart in the study case, narrating the coastlines as if she were already old enough to understand them. For the night, she heard him on the phone with Adele going over Reeve Maritime's compliance transition, methodical and patient and doing the work. She said, "You found me when you said you would. A year late, but you found me. I'm going to keep letting you find me." He said, "I spent a year trying to become someone who deserved to find you. I don't think I'm there yet, but I'm going to keep trying for the rest of my life. That's what I have to offer, not a rival, just trying." The justice of the peace said words. They said the words back. The harbor was blue and very wide. When it was done, Elena cried. Marcus looked at the sky with the expression of a man managing strong feeling in a professional context. The Kim family patriarch, standing at the bow, raised his glass without speaking, and Mara raised hers back, and they held that for a moment, the particular acknowledgement between 2 people who understood what this day was carrying, and then they both turned back to the harbor, which was doing what the harbor always did, moving, carrying things, continuing. Nora, who had been held through the ceremony by Elena and then by Dr. Huang, and then by Marcus, who had the largest hands and the most alarming default expression, and was apparently, therefore, the most effective at keeping infants calm. Slept through the entire thing with the thoroughness of a person who had decided the best available response to this level of adult emotion was unconsciousness. "She'll understand eventually," Callum said. "She'll ask us to tell her the story," Mara said. "We'll have to figure out what version to give her." "The true version," he said, as if this were obvious. "The true version involves a lot of crime. The true version involves a documents conservator who noticed something wrong with a harbor chart and changed the entire trajectory of her family's history." He looked at her. "That's what you tell her." Mara looked at her husband. The word was still new. She was still turning it over in her mind and thought about the true version. About a woman who had been invisible and stopped being invisible. About a man who had inherited the wrong things and spent 3 years doing the work to correct it. About an October afternoon in front of an open flat file and the specific moment when not looking was no longer an option. "That's a good story," she said. "It's a true story," he said. "The best ones are." In September, Reeve Maritime Services announced the completion of the first phase of its operational transition. 4 of the 7 informal port access arrangements that had constituted the company's legacy criminal infrastructure had been dissolved. The contracts structured into legitimate agreement frameworks, or exited entirely. The announcement was covered briefly in the business press, noted as a quiet corporate restructuring, and drew a short piece in the Globe from the reporter who had been following the Bernard Reeve case. Callum did not comment for publication. He sent the press inquiry to Adele, who released a 2-sentence statement and came home at 6 and made pasta. Mara read the article at the drafting table and thought about the word restructuring and what it failed to capture about the actual process. Restructuring was what you called it when you changed the organizational chart. This was something different, the careful, costly, year-long dismantling of something that had been built over 3 generations, done methodically and at significant personal and financial risk, with the specific goal of ending with something that could be looked at directly. She thought about the Portolan chart in the study case, the one of Voss had annotated 300 years ago and which she had been documenting since November. The preliminary report was finished now, the full condition assessment filed with the private archive. The chart was in better condition than she had initially thought. The surface hadn't been touched, only examined, and it would hold. It would last. The annotation would remain legible for another several hundred years if it continued to be stored correctly. She thought that's what it means to do this job. You make things last. You don't make them perfect. You make them durable and honest about what they are and capable of surviving into the future where someone else can read them. She thought that's what Callum is doing with the company. Not making it new, making it honest, making it capable of surviving into the future in a form that can be looked at. She heard Nora in the nursery, the increasingly declarative sounds of a 4-month-old who had things to express and was working on the mechanism for expressing them. She got up from the drafting table and went to the nursery and found her daughter awake and absolutely engaged with the experience of her own fists, which she had recently discovered were always available. "You have opinions about everything already," Mara said, picking her up. Nora regarded her with the profound seriousness that was currently her primary mode of interaction with the world. "You get that from both of us," Mara said. "I'm sorry." She carried Nora to the window, the harbor window, the one that had become their window, the place they brought things when they needed to think about them. October was approaching. The harbor was changing its light again, going toward the flat steel of the coming winter. In a year it had become the window, she thought, from the window she measured things against. She stood at the window and held her daughter and watched the harbor and thought about the long sequence of decisions that had delivered her here, her father filing 3 reports, a cartographer 300 years ago making a mark in a corner, a man at an auction preview giving a false name and then spending 8 months looking for the person he'd given it to, a woman stumbling in an office in October and reaching instinctively automatically for the thing that mattered most. She thought every one of those decisions was a document in the record. Every one of them had consequences that outlasted the moment of the filing. She thought the record is what remains. Callum found them there when he came home, which was what happened now, and which she thought might be one of the better things about having built this life, the coming home and the being found, the particular way a space changed when another person entered it. He came to stand beside her at the window. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and Nora, alert and investigating, turned her head toward the harbor with the expression she used when she was processing something. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The record," she said. "My father's reports. The Voss annotation on the chart. What lasts?" He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to last?" She thought about this honestly. "This," she said, "whatever this is, this specific thing we've made, I want it to last." "Then we'll do the work," he said. She looked at him. She thought about conservation, the daily attention, the small interventions, the understanding that preservation was not a single event, but a continuous practice, the acknowledgement that damaged things needed consistent care to survive. She thought about the harbor chart and its 300 years of careful handling. She thought about her father's reports 20 years in the making, waiting through the wrong hands to find the right ones. She thought this is how things last. You show up, you do the work, you put it in the record and trust that someone who matters will read it. "Yes," she said, "we'll do the work." Outside, the harbor was moving in its ancient way, carrying ships and history, and the slow, patient logic of water finding its level, and the navigation lights were beginning to come on in the channel as the October afternoon darkened into evening. And Mara Voss. Mara Reeve. She was still learning the name, still trying it on. Held her daughter at the window of the home she had not expected and had built anyway, and thought about all of the things that were now in their right places. Her father's reports in the federal record, the dock workers' names on a public acknowledgement. The suppression documented, the accountability distributed, the silence ended. The Portolan chart in its case annotated and durable, ready for the next 300 years. her mother at Sunday dinners reading to a granddaughter who was too young to understand the words and would spend years learning their weight. The patience in her slip in Marblehead properly sailed for the first time in years by a man who had decided the boat was worth sailing. And here at this window, all of it held together by the daily work of two people who had found each other in the specific way that matters not through accident or circumstance, but through the mutual decision to stop managing the distance and be in the room with the thing instead. Nora made a sound that was the beginning of something, not a word yet. Months away from a word, but something in that direction, an intention, a first draft. "Tell me what you're going to say," Callum said to her in the voice he used when he was fully present and not managing anything at all. Nora looked at him with her father's eyes gray, very direct, absolutely serious, and appeared to consider the question. Mara watched them. She thought there will be hard days. There will be days when the damage is more visible than the repair, when the weight of what was built before is heavier than the progress of what is being built now. There will be days when being the woman who married a Reeve feels like a complication she did not fully account for, and days when the company and the case and the history press up against the ordinary life she is trying to live, and it is too much. She thought, "I will do the work on those days. That's all it is. You do the work." "I know what she's going to say," Mara told him. He looked at her. "What?" Mara looked at her daughter, who was looking at the harbor with the ancient human attention of a person encountering a large body of water for the first time and finding it both significant and worthy of study. "She's going to say, 'I see it,'" Mara said. "She's going to say, 'I see what you built.' And she's going to want to know how." Callum was quiet for a moment. Then, "And we'll tell her." "We'll tell her," Mara said. The harbor held its lights. The city moved in its persistent, indifferent, perpetual way. The October evening came in slowly over the water, and the three of them stood at the window above the harbor, a woman who had stopped being invisible, a man who was becoming who he was supposed to be, and a new person who was going to know both of them and make her own decisions. And the record was what it was, and the work was not finished, and the future was not settled, but the foundation was correct. The foundation finally was correct. That was enough. That was in the end exactly enough. 2 years later, Nora Reeve took her first steps in the kitchen of the Marblehead house. They had bought it in the spring, a federal period house, on a street 2 blocks from the harbor in need of significant restoration, which Callum had pointed out with some amusement was possibly the most on-brand real estate decision Mara had ever made. She had looked at the peeling trim and the uneven floors and the windows that had not been properly maintained in 2 decades, and said, "This is salvageable." And Callum had looked at her and said, "Of course it is," and they had bought it and begun the work. It was the kind of house that rewarded patience. Old houses in New England always were. They had been built by people who understood that things needed to last, and the ones that had lasted were the ones that had been attended to consistently. The small interventions and the seasonal maintenance, and the willingness to open up a wall when you heard something wrong inside it and fix the actual problem rather than patch over it. Mara knew this professionally and applied it domestically, which drove Callum occasionally to distraction because she would stop in the middle of a room and look at a joint in the chair rail and say something needed doing, and she would be right, and then there would be a conversation about sequencing and timeline and proper technique. "You treat the house like a document," he said once. "It is a document," she said. "Everything is a document if you read it right." He had looked at her with the expression that was still, after 2 years, her favorite of his, the one where he stopped managing entirely and just looked. "I can't argue with that," he said. "I know," she said. The kitchen had been the first room they'd finished properly. Mara's insistence, because a finished kitchen made a house habitable while the rest was in progress, and the house needed to be habitable before they moved Nora's world into it. The floors were wide plank pine, original refinished carefully. The windows looked toward the harbor. The light in the late afternoon came through in exactly the particular quality she had been looking for when she'd stood in this room in January with a real estate agent who seemed baffled by the level of attention she was paying to how the light moved. Nora had been working toward walking for 2 weeks, had been standing independently for 3, had been cruising along furniture for longer, and she had chosen a Tuesday afternoon in the kitchen to attempt it, which Callum later said was further evidence for his theory about Tuesdays, which Mara still maintained was superstition, which he maintained was pattern recognition. 3 steps. She had managed 3 before sitting down with considerable force and the expression of someone who found the results of an experiment satisfactory and was ready to repeat it. Callum was across the room in 2 seconds. He crouched down to her level, and his face did the thing it always did, the absolute unguarded joy of a man who had not believed this was available to him and had been wrong. 3, he said. That was 3.
She knows, Mara said from the doorway, where she had been watching with the particular quality of a person who was trying very hard to memorize what they were seeing. She did it on purpose. Nora looked at her father with her gray, direct eyes and reached out for his hands. Again, he said. She reached again more insistently, the way she indicated when the question was not a question but a plan. Again, he said. He guided her hands to his fingers. She pulled herself to standing, worked out her balance with the concentration she brought to everything, and walked 1 step, 2, 3, 4. She stopped. She looked at her mother. 4, Mara said. You got 4 that time.
Nora's expression modulated from scientific neutrality toward something that in another year would be recognizable as satisfaction, and which was at 14 months its precursor. She sat down again. She looked between her parents with the look of a person cataloging data. Mara crossed the kitchen and sat on the floor next to Callum, which was the kind of thing she did now, without thinking the easy movement between the same space. She's going to walk to the harbor in about a week, she said. We'll need the gate checked. I checked it last week. I'll check it again. I know you will. They sat on the kitchen floor of the Marblehead house in the afternoon light while their daughter practiced the mechanics of upright locomotion, and the harbor was 2 blocks away, and the house was in progress, and the world outside was continuing in its complicated, unredeemed, ongoing way, and none of that was resolved, none of it was finished, and that was fine. That was, in fact, the correct state of things. Repair was not resolution, it was maintenance. It was the daily work of people who understood that the goal was not to finish, but to continue. Nora stood up again. 5 steps this time. She reached the cabinet and grabbed it and looked back at them with the expression of a person who has arrived somewhere and wants the fact of arrival noted. Noted, Callum said. She made a sound of acknowledgement, and then, with the attention span of someone who has been in the world for 14 months and has a great deal left to investigate, she looked at the cabinet handle and began working on the problem of whether it opened. She's going to open every cabinet in this house, Mara said. I know, Callum said. I'm looking forward to it. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the kitchen window, the harbor was doing its September thing, the light going gold and long, the water holding the color of the afternoon in the specific way that made you understand why people had been building houses near harbors for 400 years in this corner of the world, because the light on the water was something worth returning to every day for as long as you could. Tell me something true, she said. He looked at the harbor. He thought about it with the seriousness he gave to the question every time she asked it, which was why she kept asking, because the answer was always different and always honest, and that was the whole point. The patience is ready, he said. We can take her out this weekend if you want. You've been taking good care of her. She's worth taking care of. Mara looked at her husband in the afternoon light of their repaired kitchen in their house that was in the process of being repaired with their daughter, demonstrating that the cabinet handle did in fact open if you approached it with sufficient focus. And she thought about all the things in this room that were in their right places and all the things outside it that still needed work and all the days ahead in which the work would continue and the record would keep accumulating. She thought, this is the true version. This is the one we tell Nora. She thought a woman noticed something wrong and said so. A man built a case and saw it through. 3 dock workers' families got to stop living in silence. A harbor inspector's reports are in the federal record. And 2 people who had every reason to stay apart are sitting on a kitchen floor in Marblehead watching their daughter learn to walk. She thought that's the story. All of it. The damage and the repair and the daily work and the Tuesday afternoon light on the harbor and the navigation lights coming on at dusk and the old patient boat in her slip and the small person pulling herself upright on the kitchen cabinet and the record that remained honest and durable, carrying what needed to be carried forward. That's the story. That's always been the story. She thought, and it's exactly enough. Elena Voss attended Sunday dinners until she was 81. By then, Nora was in her 2nd year at Tufts studying history, which neither of her parents had been surprised by. She took after both of them in the way children do when their parents are actually similar people who have simply not admitted it for long enough. She had her mother's attention to evidence and her father's stillness, her mother's directness, and her father's patience, and a particular quality of her own that both her parents recognized but had difficulty naming. which was the capacity to walk into a damaged situation and find the structural integrity in it before she said anything.
She was very good at this.
She was also Mara had long since accepted going to be fine. Nora had grown up knowing what her grandfather had done and why it mattered, had known about Pier 14 from the time she was 8, and had asked a direct question and received a direct answer. She had grown up with the 3 workers' families in her orbit, the Marchettis and the Reyeses and Mr. Kim, who had become in a quiet, unplanned way part of the extended structure of their lives. She had grown up understanding that accountability was not vengeance, that repair was not erasure, that the record was something you tended with care. She had also grown up on a sailboat which had its own kind of instruction. Elena died in October in her room at St. Anne's on a Tuesday afternoon with Mara beside her and Callum in the corridor, and Nora on the train from Medford, who arrived in time to be in the room when her grandmother was still breathing. It was as good a death as deaths were. Elena had been ready, had been in her own words satisfied, and she went the way she had always done things, with directness and without performance. What she had said to Mara in the last conscious conversation 2 days before? "You did everything right, mija. You and that man of yours. You kept your eyes open and you did the work." And then, with the dry precision that was entirely Elena Voss, "The pasta is still too salty." Mara had laughed so hard she'd had to leave the room. At the memorial, which was small and honest, the way Elena had asked for Callum spoke. He was not, he acknowledged at the start, a man who had known Elena Voss for long enough or easily enough to claim her as someone he had always understood. She had not been easy to understand and had not been interested in making it easier. But she had been one of the few people in his life who had told him the truth about himself without cruelty and without agenda, and that was a rarer thing than most people acknowledged. He said, "She told me once that my daughter needed someone who would help her carry things, not take them from her. I've been trying to do that for 17 years. I don't always get it right, but I think about it every time." He paused. "She would be very annoyed with me for saying something this sincere at a memorial. So I'll stop." The room laughed. Nora cried. Mara held her daughter's hand and looked at her husband and thought about all the forms a family could take when people decided to build one, honestly, from the materials actually available, without waiting for the easier situation that was never going to arrive. She thought about conservation, about the way the goal was never perfection, never making the thing look new or unmarked or without its history. The goal was integrity, honesty, the thing knowing what it was and being able to survive as that thing into the future, carrying its history legibly available to whoever came next who wanted to read it. This family had its history. It carried it. It was durable. In the spring of the year Nora turned 23, she brought someone home for the first time. His name was Marco, and he worked in marine ecology, which Callum found impossibly fitting and Mara found unsurprising. He had the quality of someone who was used to looking at complicated systems and finding the logic in them, and he asked Callum about the maritime history collection in the study, with the specific interest of someone who meant it, rather than someone who was trying to impress the father. They sat in the kitchen of the Marblehead house, fully restored. Now, the way that old houses eventually get restored if enough people do enough work on them. And Mara watched her daughter across the table and her husband beside her, and this new person who was finding his way into the shape of things, and she thought, this is also the record. This accumulation. This Tuesday evening in May, with the harbor light coming through the windows and 4 people at the table, each carrying their own complicated history, each finding a way to be honest about it. Nora caught her eye across the table. A small look, daughter to mother, the specific communication of 2 people who understand each other precisely. Mara looked back. "She thought you're going to be all right." Nora looked at Marco, and then at her father, and then back at her mother with the expression that was entirely her own, the direct gray eyes and the careful attention and the quality underneath it that Mara had spent 20 years trying to identify and had finally named last year, standing in front of the portolan chart with her daughter beside her. Integrity. Nora Reeve had her grandfather's integrity. She would do the right thing at the cost of the easy things. She would build cases carefully and see them through. She would put things in the record and trust that someone would read them. She would be in the fullest sense Daniel Voss's granddaughter, and Callum Reeve's daughter, and Mara's. She would carry all of it forward. At the end of the evening, when Marco had gone, and Nora was helping with the dishes in the way she'd done since she was 8, Callum came to stand beside Mara at the harbor window. The May evening was very clear. The navigation lights were coming on in the channel. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. She's fine, he said.
I know. She's going to be extraordinary. I know that too.
He put his arm around her. She leaned in. The harbor was what it had always been moving, carrying things patient. The light on the water was the light her father had known, and his father before that, and the Voss who had annotated a chart 3 centuries ago and left a mark in a corner for someone to find. She thought about records. She thought about what lasted. She thought about the work of preservation, the daily, unglamorous, necessary work of showing up and paying attention and making the small interventions that added up to survival. She thought it all connects eventually. That's what the record is for. Tell me something true, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking the particular quality of his thinking that she had spent years learning to recognize the way he went still when something actually mattered. I would do it all again, he said. Every complicated, badly timed, expensive, terrifying thing. I would do all of it again. She turned to look at him. His face was what it always was now, when they were here, when it was just them in the harbor, and the long history they'd made together completely present, completely his. I know, she said. So would I. Outside the harbor held its lights, and the city continued in its ancient, indifferent way. And in Marblehead on a Tuesday evening in May, 2 people who had built something honest from difficult materials stood at their window and watched the water that had in one way or another held all of it. The damage and the repair, the record and the reckoning, the work and the love, and the steady, ordinary miracle of continuing. And the navigation lights moved through the channel in the old language of approach and intent, saying, I am here. I am this. I am asking to pass. And the harbor, as it always had and always would, replied, come in. Years afterward, Nora Reeve asked her mother how to know when you could trust someone. They were in the study that had been Callum's and was now in the way of rooms that hold important objects, everyone's. Nora was 28 and had just taken a position with the Massachusetts Port Authority, which neither of her parents had expected, and both had immediately understood. The Portolan chart was still in its case on the east wall. It was 50 years since Mara had first stopped in front of it in another life, in another version of herself. It had been properly documented now. The condition assessment filed the Voss annotation, photographed and notated, and entered into the record of the map itself, which meant it would survive, which meant someone would know. How did you know? Nora asked. With Dad, after everything. Mara looked at her daughter. She looked at the chart in its case. She thought about the answer that was actually true, which was that trust was not a single decision, but a series of observations, and that the observations accumulated into an assessment, and that the assessment was always provisional and always being revised by new evidence, and that this was not a weakness in trust, but the definition of it. She said, he told me the truth when he didn't have to. He told me hard things when it would have been easier to manage what I knew. And when I asked him to choose something different, something harder, he chose it. She paused. Not perfectly, not without cost, but he kept choosing it. Nora was quiet for a moment. And that was enough. It was enough to start, Mara said. The rest is the work. She met her daughter's eyes. The work is what makes it true. Anybody can say the right thing once. What matters is who keeps showing up. Nora looked at the Portolan chart. She had grown up with this chart, had heard the story of the annotation, had understood from a young age that the person who makes a mark in a corner, expecting someone to find it 300 years later, is doing an act of faith, putting something in the record and trusting the future to be the kind of place where it matters. Okay, she said. Is that a useful answer? It's the right answer. Nora looked at her mother with the gray, direct eyes and the absolute seriousness that was hers and no one else's. It's not what I wanted, but it's what I need. Those are usually the same thing, Mara said. Her daughter laughed. It was her grandfather's laugh. She'd never heard it, but Mara had. And it was direct, brief, completely genuine, the laugh of someone who finds the truth funny rather than comforting. She thought the record continues. That's what it does. It continues in the people who carry it forward, in the decisions they make and the work they do, and the things they put in the corner of the page for someone to find. She thought, this is what your father built, Dad. Not the company, not the legitimate Reeve Maritime that files its reports and cooperates with inspectors, and has under its current environmental compliance officer become one of the better-rated port operations in New England. Not the foundation in your name, though she attended every annual event and gave remarks every year that said what needed to be said. Not any of the large official things. This,
A daughter who asks the right questions and understands the answers. A room that holds a chart with 2 different names in the corner. A family that knows what the work costs and does it anyway every day, the small necessary tending of things worth preserving. That's what your reports built, Dad. That's where they went. She thought, I hope you can see it. Outside the harbor was exactly what it had always been. The navigation lights moved through the channel. The water did what water does. The record remained,